So let's go ahead and get into today's video because we got some good topics to cover. Follow me over on Decoy Voice. Make sure you subscribe to Decaf Decoy, but you guys are already watching on Decaf Decoy, so I guess that's all that matters. But let's go ahead and get to today's topic, where this was from, I think it's October. So this is them protesting ICE activity in Portland, and this is how bad it got, accomplishing nothing. But I want to point something out to you guys over here. And this is from the Black conservative preacher. Nobody's following him over on YouTube, so follow him if you haven't already. And they're all tactical Amazon purchased riot gear. And does this guy literally have on the top of his what looks like a hockey helmet a tongs? Like tongs for like cooking. Okay, he's running away. But notice how he ran in the front of a literal clown. The literal clowns are out there saying, "Hey, we're gonna stop the ICE operations." He runs away over there, past a Snoopy doll, and also a emotions expert. So, in all these mass protests all across the country from months on in, they've accomplished nothing because they had an emotions expert. Yeah, Oregon's ruined Portland. I mean, Portland ruined Portland. It's pretty bad. The thing is, like, as a true New Yorker, you apologize for these fakes you see in the city. They're not real New Yorkers, but they are now, because the majority of New Yorkers right now aren't American-born. So that's the real New York City. It doesn't matter what it was in the 90s. This is the real city right now. Yeah, that is tactical team. I like that. That's funny to me. After months on end of this, and they're getting shit popped with these pepper ball rounds. So yeah, you have this months on end, they protest, accomplish nothing. But this is how desperate they're becoming. This is a genuine ad. I guess we'll see in a minute. This is real life. This shows the sheer amount of desperation this side has because of the conversation. He's so ashamed. He's so ashamed that he's dividing from his family. He's getting insanely anxiety on this, and he's serving democratically elected leader of the country. This is what Americans want. What will you say when you ask him smashing a window? I'm wondering if this AI footage. I can't imagine they would use real footage for this. Can't imagine that would be real footage. I wonder if this is AI. Adding screens. Shoving a camera in the face of somebody because Warner broke the law. Unfortunate that that's what happens when you have a criminal that gets arrested. This wouldn't just be with immigration. This would be any instance where a parent breaks the law and someone gets arrested. But shoving the camera in their face so they can make their ad, disgusting. The shame follows you home. Sheer desperation. What will you say? Paid for by Women's March win? What is the I'm gonna ask ChatGPT right now. What does the Women's March do? They're a social and political movement that organizes protests, advocacy campaigns, and community actions focused on gender equality and human rights. The awful propaganda. Oh, is it Women's March win is George Soros? That makes sense. Progressive activism, influencing public conversations, energizing grassroots participation, and face internal controversies over leadership inclusivity. So it's one of the most recognizable women's rights advocacy. What were the controversies? Accusations of anti-Semitism and leadership infighting, and lack of inclusivity. Of course, the Women's March will have issues with inclusion. I wonder if it's not including enough male to female individuals. Financial transparency questions, yeah. Where's that money going? Disagreements over stances on Israel-Palestine, because honestly, it would be a thing where you gotta wonder if it's the Women's March. is about women's rights, would they be on the side of a country or a religion that forces them to, at the very least, cover their hair, but at the most, cover everything but their eyes, say they can't go to school, they can't read, they can't be in public unaccompanied by men? Like, there's a lot of rules that would be in direct conflict with what the women's march should be. So the left always eventually eats itself, and here we go again. Fragmentation, okay, I mean, there's a whole bunch of, oh yeah, trans exclusivity debates, like the women's march, they've gone off the rails with this. I think it's kind of funny. This ad is beyond evil. It's beyond pathetic. It's beyond desperate to do this. Like the thing is, you have all these people crying, and it's sad. There are tragedies. There are criticisms to what's happening with the arrests. Okay, I can buy that. But also, I don't think that you've seen the conservatives. Whenever you have something like an illegal immigrant murders or R's an innocent American citizen, I don't think I've seen an advertisement. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think I've seen an advertisement that shoved the camera in the faces of the families, HD 4K, crying, saying, you know, when you refuse to turn over a known criminal that's already in jail, the DHS, you're causing this. Like, I don't think I've seen that, even though it's actually the reality. I think it's kind of classless to say, hey, this person's feeling a very, very big emotion that is, this is the worst moment in their life. Let's use this, you know, like standing on the graves of people to push this thing. I think it's classless, but now you're seeing this come back from the actual official Department of Homeland Security account showing this.
Are you an illegal alien in the United States? Are you looking for the perfect holiday gift for your family? Then DHS has the best holiday deal of your life. It's the CBP Home app.
I know this is going to make them lose their mind. But yes, CBP Home app, it's a great thing. I think they get, what is it, a $1,000 exit bonus. They're given time to coordinate their departure, get their, like, you know, all their affairs in order. And also, they don't get arrested in the street. They also don't cause some riot where a U.S. citizen is at I believe it was the pot farm over in Camarillo and falls to their death while they're trying to evade the ICE agents. Like, this solves a lot of those issues, but it's going to make them lose their mind because, yeah, they have no chill at all.
It's free. It's fast. Just download the CBP Home app and fill out your information. We'll take care of your travel arrangements, and once you're home, you'll receive a $1,000 stipend.
I don't like this. I don't like it by the concept of saying, hey, you broke the rules, we're going to reward you, but apparently that $1,000 is pennies compared to how much it would cost to actually find and arrest them, send them back, and also go through the necessary channels legally to do it. So yeah, it's savings to us, but don't like the fact that we have to reward them. So yeah, thank you for the super chat. I'll read all the super chats at the end of the show.
So no delay, join the 2 million illegal aliens who have already left. Download the CBP Home app today.
Yeah, and the thing is, here you go. Despite all these massive protests, the literal clowns, and the emotions experts that popped up outside the Portland federal building, and all the crying faces they did, 2 million. Trump is winning. Americans are liking it. His approval rating is out the roof, and Americans are sick of this.
And get home for the holidays.
I'll say it's funny, maybe a little bit antagonizing. I don't know if that's where we want to be, but I think a lot of people are very happy with the way the president is operating, because what a lot of people didn't know, and what a lot of people are super upset over, is the idea that the SNAP benefit fiasco, when the government shut down and the Democrats kept on shutting the government down, a lot of Americans rely on SNAP benefits. But it kind of opened their eyes to the Democrat lies, to Democrats wanted to make sure undocumented people still had access to the SNAP benefits. And when the Republicans say we're not going to sign that part of the bill to keep the government open, all Americans are going to suffer because the Democrats insisted on them being included on our government spending. Now, the crazy part about this is, if on Google, this is actually a real thing, you can search the same thing. I say, research, Trump cuts SNAP benefits to the undocumented. The AI overview answer, this is the official answer, it's citing something from November 12th, saying undocumented immigrants have never, in bold, never been eligible for the Federal Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program or food stamps. Therefore, Trump has not cut benefits for this specific group as they were already excluded from the program. So if you go to Google, they're gonna lie to your face and say they never received these benefits. But here we are in Congress saying, hey, look, did you know that 20% of them were on it?
So this is the chart of the SNAP program. I know everyone can't see this, but this goes back to October of 2023. And I want everyone to follow. This is the red line that under Joe Biden, you see an almost 30% increase in the cost of the SNAP program over the.
And mind you, food stamps when I was a kid, some people need to be on it. Yeah, you go on hard times. Get some supplemental nutrition assistance. Like, there's a social safety net for a reason. You get on it, but it was a point of shame. It was a point of, I got laid off at the factory, I'm trying to get back on my feet. Nothing wrong with that. But the idea that it became this thing where it's just like they just use it as socialism to be able to give everybody something, no matter what, if they're a citizen or they're not, or if they're able to work or not, they just get stacks of cash because the Democrats want to sneak in socialism behind the scenes.
Years that President Biden and the USDA was overseeing with Congress funding it. And you see the downward trend since President Trump was reelected in November. I say that because the astronomical costs of the SNAP program under Joe Biden was historical. It was unprecedented. We don't have the same levels of funding that we have in the past.
We don't have the money. The country's in a deficit. We're bankrupt. I think our interest payments on our debt is more than the debt than any other cost on it. We're gonna see hyperinflation in the near future unless we fix this. I think we cut all benefits whatsoever.
Interesting. You said some of the silver lining is we're getting to look a little bit behind the SNAP program. So we know that 20% of illegals are on SNAP, and that 59% of households headed by illegals use SNAP or some other.
More than half of them receive these benefits. Mind you, search on Google and it says that they've never been eligible. That's the lie. Like, I have somebody that I know that is very, very liberal, starting to open their eyes because they're starting their own family, and they're starting to realize, like, oh my God, like, why do these people get these other benefits that I don't get? Like, they're on hard times, so they I believe they receive some sort of some form of government assistance. Or actually, they don't, because the husband makes the bare minimum. But the idea that they don't receive all these benefits, and yet you're having people that aren't even supposed to be receiving it, but they're still under the misunderstanding that they don't, in California, they don't receive medical benefits. Like, they receive free health care. It's the largest expenditure the state has, and yet we're starting to see the lies unravel right in front of our faces. It's right on the government websites, right there. It's great. And then what is it? The spider says, a TDS survivor here. Yeah, at one point in time, if you believed all the government lies, or the media lies, including what you see on Google, you would think Trump is this evil, angry person. But it's like, no, he just wanted to look into what was USAID. Why were we funding terrible people overseas? Why are we funding literal terrorism from Minneapolis, Minnesota, to go back to a country that's completing acts of terror? You're funding that, but somehow the media wants you to think you're evil for trying to uncover this.
Multiple welfare programs.
This is one of the first things we did when I walked in day one of USDA, February 13th, was we sent letters to every governor in America.
Communism.
Very clear that no illegal aliens can use SNAP. 0, 0, 0. We asked.
And why would they be angry if that was the new rule? 0, 0, 0. None of them should get it because they keep on preaching they've never received it. And whenever they're on television, they say they never received it. So if the Republicans are just confirming that, why is that an issue? Unless they were lying.
Free state for the first time in history, this was in February, to send us their data and let us, with Doge and a war room, actually start going through this data to better understand how this explosion of SNAP benefits happened under Joe Biden. We increased almost 40% on this program in just a couple of years under the Biden administration. Of course, we know
it was really bad. But the thing is, though, so Americans found out. Like, first they were buying the tears and saying, "Oh my God, he's so bad," and then they see this and they're okay. Look, they're treating them with respect, saying, here's $1,000. Then realizing they're receiving better benefits than American citizens, and now from the New York Times. The New York Times openly saying Joe Biden allowed many of them to enter the country temporarily. Again, temporarily, just losing them, letting them traffic kids, not knowing where they go. Allowing them in temporarily as a way to incentivize them to avoiding crossing the border illegally. Yeah, imagine if a store was like, you know what? People are illegally stealing our soda. Like, we just can't stay in business. So to incentivize people from not stealing our sodas, and this is a terrible analogy, I know, we're gonna let you take it temporarily. Like, this makes no sense. He's like, no, they made it legal. They're not saying, oh, he made a way to temporarily incentivize them to not commit the crime. It's like, no, he just made it legal. And he said those people became eligible to work in the U.S., receive Social Security numbers, and in some case, receive federal benefits. Like, openly admitting, receiving federal benefits. A lie that they keep on trying to tell you that they received that. It's in front of their faces. And also the idea that they were getting Social Security numbers. So basically, if they wanted to, they could register to vote. It would be a felony, I believe, but they could. But in most of the states don't have a system to detect if they register, if they're ineligible to vote. This is a massive issue. And remember, when Elon Musk took over Doge, he quickly discovered the insanity that is Social Security numbers aren't exclusive to individuals. Like, decoy voices, Social Security number is one. You also can have the Social Security as one if you're a Sabi, because we have different names and addresses. This is alarming because if there's no system to catch invalid voters in certain states, this invalidates the entire system. This had to be fixed. But again, they think you're a terrible person if you expose this. So they kept on saying it was never a part of the system. They could never receive these benefits. And now they're angry that they're removing it.
Her assessment, do you agree?
I understand the frustration, but I actually think there's going to be a work to do. As one example, that is originally the not allowing SNAP benefits for illegal immigrants was bounced, and now that's back in. So I'm pretty confident we're going to work through these and get the savings that we want, make sure illegal immigrants aren't getting their taxpayer benefits, and ultimately still delivering on all the things for American families. I'm still hopeful.
Last month, you told local outlet Missouri Net that you did not think this touched the Social Security, Medicare.
Yeah, so CNN exposing their audience to it, and now you're seeing this chart from the Center for Immigration Studies.org saying families receiving welfare. So this is their study. U.S.-born family households, 39%. Legal, over half. Illegal, almost 60%. The numbers aren't quite matching up with what Google wants to let you know. Remember, they said zero. They said zero never happens. Trump can't cut it if it doesn't exist. Well, obviously it does. Like, I'm almost laughing right here, but I shouldn't, because this is atrocious. But here's the thing. American citizens used to fall for stuff like this. Oh my God, look how sad it is. What did they tell the guy? What will you tell your, what will you say when you were enforcing border laws? And now Americans are leaning into this because they're sick of the idea of Americans being second, third, or even eighth at this point in time. But they're also upset with stuff like this. You see this, actually, somebody here on a U.S. student visa studying at University of Pennsylvania, saying globalize the infantile. This doesn't seem like a net positive to the country. This doesn't seem like somebody that wants to contribute. Why are we paying to subsidize this? Because isn't University of Penn a public school? Actually, it's a private university, I'm sorry. But I don't think that we should be allowing this person in the country. I think this person should be sent back if they seem to dislike the country so much. Wearing all this, waving this flag, disturbing the peace. You can peacefully protest. You can have your voice be heard. You have the First Amendment right if you're an American citizen. I think in places like Japan and especially China, American citizens can't go over there and protest their immigration rules. Like, they'll get kicked out. If you are all Palestinians, and I encourage you guys to go there, and I mean that sincerely, not even to be snarky. But here's the issue right now. Americans are sick of this. Like this, I want to know your thoughts on it, because apparently he's wearing a pretend device. He's wearing a pretend device on his chest. But he's protesting. He's got wires on it, and this was the free Palestinian political prisoners. It's a recent protest, not this month, but it's somewhat recent. But you see this guy, very angry, wrapped in the flag with that vest on it. I understand he's trying to make a point. But honestly, this is terrifying to me. Like, in my opinion, and let me know yours in chat, what would happen to a NYPD copper if he saw this guy from far away? maybe not necessarily. Actually, in this exact context, you have this man wrapping this flag with his vest wrapped around his chest. You don't know what it is. You see him yelling, you see him charging, he's got these wires. What would happen if the NYPD copper, like, drew and ended him? You don't want someone protesting peacefully, apparently, to be ended like that, but honestly, like, as a cop, like, you don't have time to verify, hey, is this genuinely real? Like, this would be very concerning. It's like, and why would you even wear this in the first place? Like, how does this make your, like, peacefully protesting is supposed to make it so people that don't believe your position can understand it. They can hear the other side. They can have awareness of your cause. In America, especially New York City, the victim of the largest attack, how does this convince anybody? I think Americans at one point in time likely would have been sympathetic to the cause, but not like this. And I'm concerned at the idea of an NYPD copper, especially under the new mayor, finding themselves in a situation where they see this, they make a split-second decision to stop it, and then that copper goes to prison for the rest of their life because this was just a prop. It is scary. And that's the thing, is again, Mamdani replied defunding NYPD, replacing them with mental health workers, because he lives in a dream world. He doesn't know what it actually takes to run the city. So people are upset over this happening in Brooklyn, New York. This is in their streets. Again, in the countries that are predominantly this religion, they do not do this. They don't do this in the streets. They do it in their mosque. Like, they don't go on top of taxi cabs. If you saw my video on the channel, they don't go on taxi cabs to do this. Like, this is just a show of force. Americans are sick of this, and they're willing to accept this because they don't want their country to turn into this. At worst, the guy with the fake vest, or this right now. Because you see this over here. This is the UK. This is also the clip where the liberal protester said, "Hey, we're on the same side," and he says, "No, we're not." No need for that. We're on the same side, bro. And the guy says, "No, we're not." This is what the country's turning into very quickly. But you have someone like Piers Morgan. Some people I know actually thought Piers Morgan was a conservative because he has the audacity to push back a little bit. Like, that's the only inkling of conservatism you need to just call it the obvious. But here he is saying he's okay with his entire country changing identity.
Why do you look at this and see a wrecked country?
Well, I don't see an English country. So we're in this country, what is it now? It's not. Well, people whose ancestors built Stonehenge are not here anymore. So this city one is 36% white, and that's happened in the last 140 years.
England is about 70%.
England. Okay. Well, it was 99% in 1945.
So we've evolved.
But you're on the way.
Evolved. Don't know if that's the word he wants to use here, but he's perfectly fine with this.
To becoming the minority in the country.
So what? I love living in a very multicultural.
But you're rich. I mean,
Yeah, that is exactly. All these liberals living on top, looking down, and I honestly feel the same way. Where it's like I was able to move out the hood, essentially. I was able to come out of it. It'd be easy for me to sit here and say, you know what, guys, like, of course you need, stop recidivism. Of course you need to let people out of jail and never serve time if they commit crimes. But when I walk outside my doors, I don't see the abject poverty. I don't see the crime rates. I'm not worried my car's being broken into every time I park it on the street. Rich people never see the issues. They just see other people that have to live amongst the victims of the policies you simp for on television. Weaponize ignorance.
Why do you look at this and see a wrecked country?
And then here's the thing. So you later on, someone was calling out saying, they replaced you and your home change forever because you talked about, I would rather have, at least I have yummy food. And then Piers Morgan actually replied to him, says, there's a lot of white English people I would happily trade for a good weekly chicken tiki masala. And the replies he's getting everywhere are, you already traded a couple of white English people because the faces of the individuals, of the kids that passed away in attacks from the diversity he was so clamoring for, because he wants a weekly chicken tiki masala. It's atrocious, and the idea that you see this post is unavailable. I think it's because he blocked her for this reply, but I can still see the post. So this is genuinely the tiki masala post of inclined to. Atrocious, but facts. It's sad because you see this over here, like in Germany, outside the Christmas parades. You see this a lot, where they have to put barriers so people can't drive through the Christmas parades, ending everybody that goes there. This is not the only country that currently has this, and this is the sad reality where even I've said this story a million times before, but a long time ago, I used to work a job and I hired guys in security, and they'd be, you know, like 18 to 25 years old. It's a good start a job while they're going to college. And I remember I hired this one young guy. He was from, I always try to like protect his identity, but whatever. He's from Afghanistan. He sought asylum in Germany, and then he said, I had to leave Germany because he was Muslim. And he said, Germany was becoming too Muslim for him. And he said, yeah, he came from Afghanistan, fled because he didn't like it there, gets to Germany, it becomes too much like the country he fled, and he comes to America to flee that. The same way that I would say country, they're a net negative to everybody. You don't want them around. If you can have the best and the brightest engineer from South Korea, a top-tier sergeant from Nigeria, because we have a lot of Nigerian sergeants in this country. You have them come in here, embrace American values, and contribute. We want that. That's what makes the country great. You would trade 100 decoys for a weekly General Soul chicken. I mean, I don't think that I can be used as a form of currency. A little bit scared. It's just all about assimilation. Assimilation.
Giant warehouses are popping up across the US, more than 2 every week. They feed AI algorithms, store photos, and answer our questions.
Hey Google.
A data center campus like this can consume as much power and water as an entire city. And many of the biggest server farms are emerging from the desert. But there's no official record of how many of these are being built, where they are, or even who owns them.
To be honest, I've never really run into so much resistance for records than this project.
Big tech companies often go to great lengths to hide the details. So we decided to build a map.
What we designed is a system to see not only the individual location of each data center across the country, but also where they cluster.
And for some, these clusters are appearing too close to home. We went to meet people who say having data centers next door is affecting their health.
Hard breathing, I couldn't sleep. I was like, I thought I was
Summertime is more of a... In the winter it's like... It was like an engine trying to start.
So how many data centers are there in the US? And is there enough power and water to satisfy a building boom that is only just getting started?
Where I am standing now is the middle of the data center capital of the world. This is Loudoun County, Virginia, otherwise known as Data Center Alley. And it may not look like much from down here, but let's take a look from up above.
These are Amazon data centers. Zoom out and you can see tech companies tend to build data centers in clusters, where there is a reliable power supply, access to enough water, as well as tax breaks and affordable land. But of course, these tend to also be places where lots of people already live, like Santa Clara County, California, or the most heavily populated part of Arizona, Maricopa County. And of course, here in Northern Virginia, the most densely populated part of the Washington, D.C. metro area, and one of the largest and fastest growing residential areas in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, I was the fourth homeowner in this neighborhood, fourth to occupy a house in this neighborhood.
Donna Gallant has lived on this street in Prince William County, Northern Virginia, for the last 30 years. All very peaceful until 2021, when things started to change. These are Google data centers, and ever since they started rising from the ground, Donna has been looking for answers.
There's no transparency, and well,
With local authorities?
so anytime you ask a question, it's, oh, we signed an NDA, we can't talk about it. Oh, so there's no transparency at all.
The site isn't complete yet, but she says the noise is already taking its toll.
When I go to my room at night, the tonal noise immediately triggered my anxiety to the point where I couldn't sleep. I ended up having to go down on my first floor and put noise-canceling headphones on just so I could sleep.
But for Donna and her neighbors, this is just the start. Over the next few years, they will find themselves surrounded by a string of new data centers.
That's gonna go from this road here all the way and around my neighborhood. That's where
There's an interesting trend happening in the world today of full-scale revolutions or political demonstrations initiated primarily by the younger generations, like Gen Z. And although it isn't necessarily unusual to see big changes happening in the world like that, I think that something that's interesting about these recent wave revolutions compared to the past is that lately we've seen the same symbol of unity and solidarity reoccurring. This, of course, if you've been keeping up, is the Jolly Roger of the Straw Hat Pirates from One Piece, which, as of the time of recording this video, has appeared in dozens of protests from countries all around the world, From Nepal, where Gen Z protesters flying One Piece flags literally overthrew their government and forced the Prime Minister to abdicate, to different movements and protests in Indonesia, Mexico, Madagascar, France, the Philippines, and even popping up with certain demonstrations in the United States. Gen Z is really rallying around this symbol specifically as a banner of revolution or as a demonstration of the cultural unity and alignment of our generation. What makes this all the more interesting to me is that none of it was orchestrated or organized either. There's no central influence telling young people to fly this flag. There isn't even an official movement or leader or cause to rally around. This symbol is just spread organically, almost instinctively, through shared culture, shared frustration, and shared hope. Almost as if young people all across the globe reach the same conclusion independently. If no one is going to represent us, we'll represent ourselves. And so they picked a symbol that already meant something to them. A symbol tied to freedom, loyalty, and fighting for a better world, even when the odds are impossible. A symbol from a story that shaped their childhoods and carried them into adulthood. Something that we as a generation, having grown up at the same time in the same world, can bond over and relate with. And suddenly the Straw Hat flag isn't just a fictional emblem anymore. It's become a real banner of courage, a rallying point for people who feel unheard, and a reminder that even ordinary individuals can stand up and challenge entire systems when change is needed. Around the world, we're seeing this flag raised by students who want a future, by workers demanding dignity, and by citizens exhausted with corruption, censorship, and inequality. Whether the protests succeed or fail, whether they're justified, whether they can spark reforms or revolution, the message behind that flag is clear. It's not tied to one ideology or one nation, or one political party. Instead, it represents something deeply human and universal. The belief that ordinary people can stand together, choose their own destiny, and refuse to accept a world that feels rigged against them. In the story of One Piece, the Straw Flag isn't a symbol of conquest. It's a symbol of freedom. It's a promise that no matter how corrupt or oppressive the world becomes, there will always be people stubborn enough, hopeful enough, and brave enough to challenge it. And that's exactly how it's being used today. When you see that flag in a crowd of protesters, you're not just seeing an anime reference, you're seeing a declaration. A declaration that this generation refuses to be silent, that they're willing to fight for the future they were told they'd inherit, but never got. That they believe in a world where community matters more than power, where justice matters more than tradition, and where you don't need permission to demand something better. And I think what's even more striking about this is that people carrying these flags aren't typically extremists or radicals. They're students, workers, young parents concerned with their children's futures, ordinary people who are tired of watching their leaders ignore them. The flag they're all flying has become a way of saying, we want change, and we're not afraid to stand together to make it happen. However small one voice or one movement is on its own, in the broad strokes, these movements in general are starting to send a subtle message to governments, to corporations, and anyone who doubts the strength of this generation. That while you can dismiss individuals easily enough, you can't ignore millions of us united under a shared symbol and a shared cause. Maybe we don't have the cause part down, but I think the recurrence of this same flag, this same motif, is a sign that there is becoming a bit more unity among the younger demographics. That we're starting to look at the corruption and decay of our society, and we've gotten to the point where we're ready to do something about it. And that, in a way, is why this flag keeps showing up. Not because of the show it came from, but because of what it represents right now. A generation that refuses to give up, even when the world gives them every reason to. And when you really think about it, that's the heart of it. This flag keeps appearing because it's become the shorthand for a generation that's done waiting. A generation that's tired of empty promises, tired of inherited crises, tired of leaders who speak of the future while refusing to build one. It's a signal flare, a warning shot, a quiet but undeniable announcement that the world is changing, whether the people in charge are ready for it or not. Because behind every straw flag in those crowds, there's a story. Someone who grew up believing in fairness and opportunity and stability, and then had to face the reality that those things weren't guaranteed. Someone who saw the systems they were told to respect fall short again and again. Someone who realized that they didn't stand up and demand something better, no one was going to hand it to them. And that's why this symbol resonates so deeply. It blends idealism with rebellion, hope with defiance, childhood imagination with adult responsibility. It's a reminder that even in dark, uncertain times, young people still believe in the possibility of a better world and are willing to fight for it. And maybe that's what's so inspiring about all this. These movements aren't perfect, they're messy, they're emotional, they're sometimes chaotic. But they're real, they're honest, and they're born from a place of wanting something better, not just for themselves, but for everyone who'll come after them. Because movements like these have always started this way. Quietly, symbolically, with ordinary people deciding they're done being spectators in their own futures. And every time this flag rises above a crowd, it's another reminder that change doesn't start in the halls of power. It starts on the streets, in the schools, and the hands of people who believe the world can be more than what it's become. And the thing is, once you recognize that, it becomes impossible to underestimate what we're witnessing. Because symbols don't rise on their own. They rise when enough people feel the same pressure, the same disappointment, and the same longing for change. They rise when an entire generation realizes that if they don't take the wheel, the road ahead is going to be decided for them. So when you see that flag, you're not just seeing frustration, you're seeing agency. You're seeing young people refusing to be passengers in a world that keeps veering off course. You're seeing the early echoes of a generation trying to reclaim its future piece by piece, protest by protest, voice by voice. And as these demonstrations spread, something else starts to emerge. A sense of shared experience, a recognition that even though these countries are separated by borders, languages, and histories, the struggles they face rhyme in a similar way. Inequality, corruption, censorship, economic instability, generational neglect. It's no wonder the same symbol keeps showing up. The problems are global, so the response has to become global as well. And maybe that's where the real power lies, not just in the protests themselves, but in the realization that young people everywhere are waking up to the fact that their individual fights are part of a much larger story. A story about a generation that grew up connected digitally, culturally, and emotionally, and is now discovering what that connection can actually do in the real world. We're watching young people take the stories and values they grew up with, friendship, justice, courage, and loyalty, those things which we learned from One Piece, and translate them into action, into real pressure, real demands, real calls for accountability. Gen Z is refusing to inherit a world built on broken promises. They're refusing to let apathy be the defining trait of youth. And if this momentum continues, if this shared identity keeps strengthening, and these protests are not an endpoint, they're the opening chapter of something much larger, something that could redefine what civic participation looks like in the 21st century, something that could reshape how younger generations see themselves, not as isolated voices scattered across different nations, but as a global community with shared struggles, shared values, and shared determination. Because once people recognize that their frustrations aren't unique, that their hopes aren't isolated, it becomes much harder for anyone to convince them that change is impossible. And what's remarkable is that it isn't driven by power or wealth or institutional influence. It's driven by culture, by the stories we grew up with, the characters we admired, the ideals we absorbed almost without realizing it. It's driven by a generation raised on narratives about found family, resilience, standing up to injustice, and protecting the vulnerable. A generation that saw these ideas not just as fiction, but as something worth carrying into the real world. In a way, the straw flag is simply the vessel. The real force behind all of this is the collective will that we live in. It's their exhaustion, their courage, their shared refusal to accept that this is just how things are. And as long as that will exists, as long as people keep stepping out into the streets, raising their voices, and lifting symbols that unify instead of divide, then there is always a potential for more than just protest. There is a potential for transformation. And maybe that's what scares the people in power most. Not the flag itself, but what it represents. A generation that isn't content to wait its turn or follow the script or pretend everything is fine when it clearly isn't. A generation that grew up online, learned to see through empty rhetoric, and isn't afraid to call hypocrisy when it sees it. A generation that, despite everything stacked against them, still chooses hope over cynicism every time. If this is what the early stages look like, scattered uprisings, shared symbols, spontaneous unity, then imagine what it could become when these movements start learning from one another, when ideas start crossing borders faster than governments can respond, and when solidarity becomes not just symbolic, but strategic. Because once a generation realizes its own strength, once it understands that its voice carries weight, its choices matters, and its unity can shift the world, then when the real change begins, that's when the future stops feeling like something imposed on us and starts becoming something we build together. And if we're standing at the beginning of that shift, at the first tremors of something bigger, then it raises an important question for all of us watching this unfold. What happens next? Because symbols can open the door, but it's people who have to walk through it. Unity can spark momentum, but it's action that carries it forward. And this moment we're living in, this strange and unexpected convergence of culture and politics, frustration and hope, imagination and reality, it won't mean anything unless we choose to do something about it. The straw hat flag might have started as a piece of fiction, but the conversations it's inspiring, the solidarity it's creating, and the courage it's awakening, that's real. And it's a reminder that our government has more influence, our generation has more influence, more creativity, and more collective power than we often realize. But with that realization comes a responsibility. A responsibility to stay informed, a responsibility to stay engaged, a responsibility to recognize that we're not alone in the challenges we face, that our voices are stronger when they rise together. Because no single protest is going to fix everything. No single symbol is going to solve the problem of inequality, of corruption, of political stagnation. But the willingness to speak out, the refusal to stay silent, the decision to stand behind others, those are the seeds of every meaningful change humanity's ever seen. And maybe that's the real legacy of this moment. Not the flag itself, not the anime it comes from, but the discovery or rediscovery that ordinary people still carry extraordinary power when they act together. That we don't have to wait for someone older, richer, or more influential to give us permission to care about our world. This generation has already shown that it's ready to shape the future. The only question now is how far we're willing to go, and what kind of world we want to build along the way. So there's one thing I hope we take away from all this, is that the future isn't some distant concept waiting quietly on the horizon. It's being shaped right now in real time, by the choices we make and the courage we show, and whether we're someone out in the streets holding a flag, someone organizing behind the scenes, or simply someone paying attention and refusing to look away, you're a part of the story. You're a part of this moment. And if we keep pushing, keep questioning, and keep standing together, then maybe years from now we'll be able to look back at this point, this generation, and realize that this is where things finally began to change. Not because we inherited a better world, but because we built one. Thanks, guys.
Dresses and sashes, complemented by overcloaks, while headdress varied by local custom. This clothing was largely spun from wool shorn from their llamas and alpacas, which, along with guinea pigs, provided meat. Communal support eased the burden of this life, but in the preceding centuries, warring, decentralized factions had raided and pillaged widely. Pachacuti now offered the people and their lords the security of the Inca Empire. By the ancient custom of reciprocity, peasants received safety and certain quantities of gifts or food from the state, and were in turn obliged to fulfill the mita, the taxation paid in labor. The Incas did not use currency. The head of each household typically owed the empire 2 to 3 months of labor, often farming, making textiles, or constructing imperial works. The Incas limited and rotated labor demands so as not to deprive communities of their self-sufficiency. And the empire demanded of its men an additional task: to fight for their king. Many lords would not willingly relinquish power to the Incas. While the chronology and details of Inca conquest differ in many accounts, a general picture of expansion emerges. Early in the reign of Pachacuti, a conqueror called Chuchicapac insisted that the so-called Earthshaker pay homage to him, whereafter he would use the skull of Pachacuti as a goblet from which to drink in triumph. Chuchicapac ruled the Coyas to the southeast. The undaunted Pachacuti would show them the power of the Incas. The army traversed the mountains and arrayed for a pitched battle. The core warriors of Cusco wore helmets and carried shields made of thickly padded cloth, often reinforced with cane. But the Inca army largely consisted of less equipped commoners, sometimes using cloaks as shields. Maces, spears, halberds, clubs, and slings served as their principal weapons. At the opening of battles, rocks and javelins stunned the enemy before the Incas launched their direct assault, buttressed by divisions ready to attack flanks or act as reserves. The Coyas stood their ground for hours until Pachacuti and his guard cut through and captured Chuchicapac. The spirit of the enemy withered, and victory followed. The Incas generally spared captive soldiers, but they were less inclined to extend the same mercy to enemy commanders. Pachacuti and his army returned to Cusco and publicly beheaded Chuchicapac. Pachacuti had shaken the region, and many lords of the Altiplano submitted. Leaders who freely bent the knee would retain local rule and receive imperial privileges and rewards. Those who refused would suffer the Inca army, which at its peak could number more than 100,000 soldiers. Drawn up for battle, the Incas employed psychological warfare. One account recalled the Incas shouting, "We will drink from the skull of the traitor. We will adorn ourselves with a necklace of his teeth. We will play the melody of the pincuyu with flutes made from his bones. We will beat the drum made from his skin, and thus we will dance." Most enemies simply surrendered, and conquest proceeded without bloodshed. As the Incas marched into their new domains, they did not loot or massacre. Rather, Inca officials folded local leaders into the state apparatus, then constructed storehouses filled with massive stockpiles of food, drink, textiles, and other supplies, to be distributed as gifts for the loyal, provisions for those who served the state, or relief in times of famine.
Many storehouses stood high on open hills, ever visible reminders of the prosperity and generosity of the Inca overlords. The emperor was styled Huacchacoyac, lover and benefactor of the poor. Each conquered household and lord was duly reported to Cusco. The Incas did not use a written alphabet or system of glyphs. Rather, people of a learned class, and perhaps some commoners, recorded and relayed information with quipus, knotted cords of various colors attached to a central cord. Understood in the context of its message, the placement of knots and colors encoded precise information. Officials thereby recorded history, kept inventories of storehouses, took a regular census of the imperial population, and delivered news to and from the warfront. Having brought low the Coyas in the southern dominions, Pachacuti had consolidated his hold on the revered Lake Titicaca. It was here that the Incas believed the creator god named Viracocha brought into existence the sun, moon, and stars. The Incas fervently venerated the sun god Inti, but recognized Viracocha as the original cause of all things, who imbued the world with light, knowledge, and order. It was this creator god who was believed to have sculpted statues at the lakeside ruins which so captured Inca imagination. These monuments, gateways, and abandoned temples were in fact the vestiges of the long-dead Tiwanaku civilization, which urbanized in the 4th century and steadily expanded. For the Incas did not represent some sudden ascent from a static past of humble villages. The Andean region had flourished as a cradle of complex states and urban centers for millennia. On the coast, the ancient Nazca Confederation erected great cities and marked the desert floor with colossal drawings of animals and people. In the great Moche civilization constructed pyramids that now sloped in the sun, their kings entombed with their treasures like the pharaohs of old. Portrait vessels displayed the Moche mastery of artistic naturalism, each wrinkle and subtle expression of an ancient people preserved in ceramic. Most of the great polities declined, and by 1000 AD, valleys were abandoned and raiding dominated the fractured Andes. Now, in the middle of the 15th century, only one power remained that could resist the growing empire of Pachacuti. The Timor Empire held dominion over 1 million people along the sandy coast. High walls and statues framed its sprawling capital of Chanchan, whose irrigated farms, streets, and temples may have supported some 30,000 inhabitants. Undeterred, Pachacuti conquered northwest through the Peruvian Sierra and along the coast. On one of several northern campaigns, Pachacuti sent a gallant young commander, his son, Tupac Yupanqui. The Incas conducted espionage before campaigns, identifying enemy vulnerable marvels. Royal estates likely built under Pachacuti included the sublime Ollantaytambo, in a mountaintop settlement later known as Machu Picchu. There, clouds drifted among temples and residences, with trapezoidal windows and doors, much of it built of stones hewn so perfectly together that a knife's edge could not fit between them. Cool spring water trickled down the stone aqueducts of Machu Picchu, reaching first the royal baths and pooling out from fountains. All across the empire, the Incas constructed aqueducts and canals that irrigated farmland and routed water into settlements. Moreover, they connected the western edge of the continent like never before. At its height, the Inca road network measured an estimated 25,000 miles, linking the desert, mountains, and jungle. In certain stretches, it was finely paved, with stairs that climbed steep bluffs and walls, drains, and culverts to prevent erosion where needed. Simpler roads branched off to mountain shrines, mines, and settlements. Chasms were surmounted by woven bridges. This ambitious empire most of all demanded speed and communication. The Incas established a system of thousands of messengers or chasquis of impressive stamina, who perpetually manned waypoints at every 5 miles or so along the main roads. The previous runner signaled his arrival with a conch shell, related his message verbatim, and often delivered a quipu. In this manner, Inca messages could travel some 170 miles in 24 hours. Communication that took weeks by horseback in the colonial era was accomplished by the chasqui system in mere days. This burgeoning system enabled seasoned Inca generals to lead armies on campaigns of conquest or consolidation. Tupac Yupanqui's travels along the coast brought him to the foot of the enemy fortress of Ungara. Their stones and lances repelled his attacks, and he pulled back. When the defenders left to celebrate their triumph, the concealed Incas slaughtered them on the coast and adorned the fortress with the swaying bodies of the enemy. To ensure loyalty after conquest, the Incas seized local items of worship to be held in Cusco. The captive relics thereby dissuaded rebellion and made the capital a place of pilgrimage. As the years passed, the armies of Pachacuti also conquered far north into the trying terrain of Ecuador. Tupac Yupanqui and his men came to the island of Puna. The chronicles relate he encountered merchants on sailing rafts who told him of distant populated islands they had visited. Tupac Yupanqui was said to have undertaken a 9-month voyage and returned with people and goods. Though the account may have been apocryphal, later writers speculated that he had reached the Galapagos or even Rapa Nui, known as Easter Island. Genetic and floral evidence do indicate that Polynesians made contact with South Americans before European arrival. Whether the Incas participated is much less certain. Tupac Yupanqui and his massive Inca armies were most accustomed to long journeys by land. The Incas forbade their soldiers to loot the innocent countryside, and so a large fraction of military caravans comprised porters and llamas to haul provisions. Along the way, settlements were to support the armies, and at regular intervals along the road, the Incas installed storehouses full of weapons, clothing, and food. People of the Andes preserved certain foods by an ancient method of freeze-drying that combined dehydration and exposure to the elements. Freeze-dried meat was called charqui, the origin of the word jerky. After one arduous march east, Tupac Yupanqui and the Incas entered the Amazon. Nectarous flora and curious creatures enthralled the Incas, but the woods were also home to innumerable people. Conquest proceeded more simply where large polities could surrender on behalf of vast regions. The forest was different. Minor victories nonetheless earned the Incas colorful feathers, gold and honey, and new subjects. The Incas also attempted to culturally assimilate those they encountered. The chronicler wrote of one expedition into the rainforest. Thus, Tupac Yupanqui went subjugating all those that he could find and take. Seeing that these people went naked, as was their custom, they were given tunics and cloaks and made to dress. They wore the cloaks that day, and in the evening went to their shacks. The next morning they appeared naked, as was their custom, before the Inca Tupac Yupanqui, and the Inca laughed. Expansion diversified the Inca army, which came to include bowmen of the forest and troops of the desert. Hardly monolithic, the empire would include millions of people of varied traditions and faiths, who spoke over 150 languages. The Incas, for their part, spoke Quechua and enshrined the language as an imperial lingua franca. According to the Incas, their conquests were in part driven by an imperative to civilize the world. Beyond their state religion, they observed well-defined ethics and norms. They condemned cannibalism and the consumption of dog meat. They punished adultery and suspected witchcraft and exalted family. A growing population strengthened the empire. In some regions, provincial governors arranged marriages between unmarried commoners. It was perhaps after his first foray into the Amazon that Tupac Yupanqui returned to the aging Pachacuti, who told him, "Son, you now see how many great nations I leave to you, and you know what labor they have cost me. Mind that you are the man to keep and expand them. When I am dead, take care of my body, that I may go to rest with my father, the sun." The passing of the great Emperor Pachacuti sent a tremor through a world suffused with divine will and ancestral spirits. The Incas marked his death by offering to the gods that which was most precious to them. Treasures were buried or destroyed, thousands of llamas slaughtered, and hundreds of people sacrificed. Youths from across the empire who would join their king in death. Sacrifice had been practiced for millennia in Andean societies, and though the Incas did not practice it on a consistent or massive scale, they turned to it in times of natural disaster and changes of rulership. The story of Pachacuti did not end with his death. The Incas believed the dead took another form, that their essence remained bound to the body. The mummies of former kings and queens continued to inhabit estates, attended to by their kin, and consulted by shamans on imperial affairs. Even so, active kingship passed to Tupac Yupanqui, who mourned his father and then mustered his troops to return with renewed vigor to the jungle. Despair and confusion awaited them. The stories told that the forests were very dense and full of evil places, so that they could not force their way through, nor did they know what direction to take. The Sapa Inca would secure the submission of many, but skirmish and sickness hounded their stray march, until at length a general rescued the lost emperor. In his absence, the Koyas had led a revolt, slaying Inca officials and retreating to forts. In times of rebellion, smoke signals could rapidly alert the empire of crisis. Tupac swiftly raised an army tens of thousands strong, crushed the Koyas, and turned the skins of their captains into drums. Most conquered territories were subject to the Mitma, the mass resettlement policy of the Incas. The empire forcibly moved hundreds of thousands of people. Segments of rebellious populations like the Koyas were scattered from their homelands, loyal subjects sent to replace them. Other populations were simply moved in order to work less cultivated regions. The rebellions quelled, it may have been then that Tupac Yupanqui conquered into Argentina and far into Chile, halting only around the Maule River. Some records indicated that there the Incas clashed with the mighty Mapuche people in a costly multi-day battle. Whether weakened by the march or warfare, Tupac Yupanqui turned his armies back. The Incas called their growing empire Tawantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters. Each of these parts was managed by a governor, with lower officials overseeing the over 80 provinces across the empire. This refined system of governance managed the labor of hundreds of thousands of subjects. Boundless were the brilliant textiles, gold, food, and drink that flowed into the capital and other principal cities. In Cusco, Tupac Yupanqui continued the construction of great works, including Sacsayhuaman, a soaring temple or fortress comprising a tower and elaborate buildings, atop several levels of cyclopean walls, made from colossal boulders cut, pulled, and by some ingenious process, elevated and impeccably fitted together. Decades later, a European visitor would write it was the greatest castle his countrymen had ever laid eyes on, and these walls are the most beautiful thing that can be seen of all the constructions. They are of such big stones that no one who sees them would say that they have been placed there by the hand of man. As Tupac Yupanqui well knew, his powerful throne was to one day pass from father to son, while a Sapa Inca would marry many secondary wives for purposes of alliance. He was to devote himself to a queen who wielded influence and whose children alone could be legitimate heirs. Intimate relations between cousins or closer relatives were forbidden to commoners, but among the royals it strengthened familial power and security. Tupac years before took as his primary wife his own full sister, Mama Okyo, who bore him a capable son named Huayna Capac. Upon the death of the great conqueror Tupac Yupanqui around the year 1493, royal blood was spilled in a struggle for succession, until at last Huayna Capac emerged as the new Sapa Inca. He ordered campaigns in the east and far north, and led armies against rebellious peoples. When he advanced on a citadel of intransigent people in the north, he was thrown from his litter and nearly fell into the hands of the enemy. The shame was avenged in short order. The Incas chased these enemies to the water's edge and massacred them, such that thereafter the lake was called Yawarcucha, the Lake of Blood. Huayna Capac devoted his years of rule most of all to maintaining the empire. On high hills, vigilant forts stood against the harrying raids of border peoples. The Incas had conquered the sands, mountains, the grassy valleys, and the edge of the jungle, and found no power that threatened Cusco. These were the days of the Pax Incaica, a land once dominated by fractious warfare, now a vast corridor of imposed peace. Inca rule, which at once resettled, dominated, and demanded of its people, also brought forth prosperity. high yields of crops, infrastructure, and a stable safety for the common family. Perhaps it was by the audacity and brilliance of Pachacuti and his sons that the Incas of Cusco came to rule so extensive a domain. But this was a grand and mighty empire, inhabited, defended, and built by millions of people. The age of abundance and security under Huayna Capac would not last. 2 decades after his reign, it was written, "The empire of the Incas was so peaceful then that in so great a land there was no one found who dared to make war or to disobey Huayna Capac. But just as after Alexander's death in Babylon, when many of his servants and captains sought to make themselves kings and rule great lands, so too after Huayna Capac's death, there were wars and disputes between his sons. And following these, the Spaniards arrived." The coming apocalypse arrived unheralded by omen or prophecy. It was a plague that claimed the life of Emperor Huayna Capac around the year 1528. He would join his forefathers in the halls of Cusco, in the realm which stretched from the jungles and mountains to the desert coast, and passed to his designated heir. But the pestilence killed this son too. It may have been smallpox from Europe, spreading from the distant north in the wake of conquest. For some time there had been whispers about strange, pale men along the imperial borders, but the Incas were beset by turmoil from within. Another son of the emperor, Huáscar, claimed the throne. This mad king tormented the aristocracy, shattered tradition, and murdered his relatives in a fit of paranoia. His war-hardened half-brother, Atahualpa, remained camped in the north with his loyal army. The land ran with blood as the brothers carried on a terrible civil war. And at last, when the warriors of Atahualpa overran Cusco, Huáscar was imprisoned, his wives and children executed as he watched. Atahualpa was not content to merely eradicate the future line of his rival brother. He would destroy the past as well. Dead nobles were believed to retain power and vitality, and so Atahualpa's men burned the mummified remains of the great conqueror, Tupac Yupanqui. The millions of varied people across the empire would now answer to Atahualpa, who planned a victorious trek south to take his throne in Cusco. But the ascendant ruler received reports of brightly armored, bearded marauders traveling inland on the backs of large beasts. No more than 200 men. At length, the intrigued Atahualpa decided to grant them an audience. Thus, in 1532, the fall of the Inca Empire began. Each breath drew in heavier among the peaks. Here the signs of empire grew more frequent, be they the paved roads or hilltop forts. The armored strangers and their handful of enslaved Africans were not lost wanderers. In 1492, Columbus had ended the long and near total silence between the two halves of the world, and the Spanish invasion began. Aided by disease and native rebellion, Hernán Cortés conquered the Aztecs of Mexico, while others pushed farther. Now, a decade later, it was a distant cousin of Cortés, the roughly 54-year-old Francisco Pizarro, who led a perilous quest into the Inca world. The intrepid and stern Pizarro had scouted parts of the South American coast on 2 previous voyages launched from Central America. Having found evidence of a gold-rich civilization, he had received the official blessing of Emperor Charles V for this present mission. The Spaniards did not desire alliance or trade, but conquest. They plundered storehouses, gathered intelligence, and, translating through a previously captured indigenous man, made contact with Inca imperial representatives. After many arduous miles, the Spanish arrived at the town of Cajamarca, where a meeting with the new Inca ruler Atahualpa would take place the following day. Marvelous temples and walls of masterful stonework bordered the streets. Captain Hernando de Soto rode out for a preliminary audience with Atahualpa, for their host was not in the city. That night the surrounding hills glowed with the firelights of a large Inca army, warily camped some distance away. These Inca warriors were thoroughly battle-tested. Hailing from across the empire, Inca troops could possess shields in varying degrees of cloth armor. They attacked at range with slings and bows, and closed the distance with spears, maces, and other sidearms of stone or bronze. In victory, the Incas often spared enemy soldiers, but executed hostile commanders, turning their skin and bones into drums, flutes, and goblets. Yet Inca weapons would not pierce the steel armor, helmets, and shields possessed by the Spaniards, who fought with swept-hilt swords and polearms, as well as crossbows and a handful of arquebus firearms. Pizarro and his crew counted only 168 fighting men, but they were seasoned soldiers. Most had spent considerable time in the New World, and a few officers were veterans of the conquest of Mexico. Atahualpa tarried the next day, until at last he was carried on the royal litter into the sprawling plaza of Cajamarca, flanked by several thousand men. The Spaniards appeared to have vanished. The Spanish friar then approached the ruler and spoke a paraphrased form of the requerimiento, the demand given to native peoples of the New World to submit to the divine authority of the Spanish crown, with the warning, "And if you do not do this, then with the help of God we shall make war on you everywhere and in every way that we can. We shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the Church and His Majesty. We shall seize your women and children, and we shall make them slaves, to sell and dispose of as His Majesty commands. We shall do all the evil and damage to you that we are able. And I must insist that the deaths and destruction that result from this will be entirely your fault." He handed the emperor a prayer book. Atahualpa, confused at the obscure markings on its pages and indignant over the thieving conduct of the Spaniards, cast it onto the ground. The Spanish now had a pretext to proceed with their plan. From hidden positions around the plaza, the Spaniards emerged with a salvo of gun and cannon fire. The Incas were choked at narrow exits and pressed against walls as armored titans trampled over them. The wave of steel claimed limbs and heads, and after hours of fighting, the plaza was left a mutilated heap of Inca warriors. The attackers succeeded in capturing Atahualpa alive, and so he became a hostage king in Cajamarca, compelled to ensure his people obeyed the invaders. Unknown to him, Europeans had first entered the empire during his father's reign. A Portuguese castaway named Aleixo Garcia washed up in Brazil with some of his companions. He joined the Guarani people in a large raid on the Inca Empire in 1524, but died the following year. The curious Atahualpa now inquired many things of his captors, and they of him. It was seen that, like the Spanish, the royal Incas claimed divine authority. They believed Inti, the venerated sun god, had given them this empire, and so long as the echoes of the divine dwelt in the heavens, rivers, and mountains, none would take it from them. Though the Spanish faith remained mysterious to Atahualpa, he had at least discerned their lust for silver and gold. He proposed a sort of ransom, either to win his freedom or merely save his life. He promised Pizarro that within 12 months he could fill half the height, or around 8 feet, of a 22 by 17 foot room with gold, and also twice the entire room with silver. The astounded Pizarro agreed, and precious metals from across the empire would soon arrive, heap by heap, in Cajamarca. Realizing his precarious hold on the throne, Atahualpa had his imprisoned brother Huáscar assassinated. The hostage emperor was nevertheless obliged to allow the Spaniards to plunder and wander his lands. It was as though the conquistadors had entered a parallel thread of time, men of the old world stumbling into the Andean cradle of civilization, whose people's history and sacred pantheons were utterly alien to them. They knew nothing of the ancient aqueducts and fountains, the gods of Tiwanaku, or the pyramids of the Moche. And it was only about a century before the Spanish arrival that the one called Pachacuti Earthshaker established the Inca Empire. The armies of the Inca flooded down the mountains, offering peace and wealth to those who submitted, and death to lords who challenged them. Now these conquistadors beheld the civilization that recorded history, took inventory of imperial supplies, and collected census data to inform labor taxation, military conscription, and food production. A civilization that built colossal mountain estates, temples and forts, and aqueducts. The Spaniards explored this Inca world on its incredibly vast road system, which bridged over chasms and featured relay message stations and supply posts. The strangers could hardly make sense of what they saw. In human memory, I believe that there is no account of a road as great as this, running through deep valleys, high mountains, banks of snow, torrents of water. In all places it was clean and swept free of refuse, with lodgings, storehouses, sun temples, and posts along the route. Oh, can anything similar be claimed for Alexander or any of the powerful kings who ruled the world? A few Spaniards journeyed to Cusco and marveled at its planned and paved streets. There they beheld Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun, whose walls were topped by sheets of gold. There were a great many treasures here, including the priceless Imperial Garden. Life-size sculptures of llamas, birds, other animals, and human figures, beside a field of maize and flowers, all of it made of silver and gold. The Incas believed gold to be the sacred tears of the sun. In Cajamarca, the gold and silver of the empire soon filled the ransom space. The Spanish promptly melted the over 40,000 pounds of holy items into ingots and divided them amongst themselves. Such was the dream of every lowly conquistador who dared undertake such a fateful journey. Shares were determined by rank, and still each ordinary man received a fortune worth millions of dollars. However, over 100 reinforcements had recently arrived under the command of Diego de Almagro. Almagro was Pizarro's partner on the previous expeditions to the South American coast, and he was incensed to receive almost no part of the ransom. At any rate, Atahualpa had delivered the treasure, but he was not freed. Over 8 months of captivity, he had regaled his captors with his intelligence and even learned to play chess, but the Spanish had detected fault lines within his dominion. While many revered the sacred rule of Atahualpa, the Inca legacy of conquest, tribute demands, and forced resettlement had made certain subject peoples hostile to the emperor. Moreover, to the great fortune of Pizarro, the Inca Empire was freshly bleeding from the civil war. Armies were depleted, and followers of the late Huáscar remained mortal enemies of Atahualpa. The life of this strong-willed ruler and the fear that he may rebel now seemed a burden to the Spanish. They hastily convicted Atahualpa of treason and ordered him burned at the stake in July of 1533. As he was dragged to the place of execution, Atahualpa repeated, "Why are they killing me? What have I done?" He was given the choice to die by strangulation instead of fire, if he permitted the priests to baptize him. He accepted, perhaps because the Incas held the preservation of the body to be paramount for continued existence after death. The Spanish duly conferred the blessing of baptism on the sovereign, and then choked the life from him. Although the invaders had come in search of land and riches, the sincere belief that they carried salvation to the otherwise doomed souls of these foreign lands added a moral and religious dimension to their imperial aspirations. As Spaniards now encountered splendid Inca houses of worship, they described them as mosques. The specter of old world holy wars still loomed in their minds. Constantinople had fallen to the Muslim Ottomans less than a century before, and Columbus reached the New World the very same year that his royal benefactors completed the Reconquista, the expulsion of Spain's erstwhile Muslim rulers along with Jews. Even now against the Incas, the Spanish battle cries invoked Santiago. the belief that the Apostle St. James had once miraculously returned to lead the Spaniards to victory in a battle against the Moors. Enlivened by a sense of divine fate, the Spanish departed Cajamarca and undertook the long march to Cusco. If some passing subjects hailed them as liberators who had toppled a false king, others wished to vanquish the regicides. No longer bound by the coerced commands of a hostage emperor, Inca generals and their troops attacked the Spanish army and their indigenous auxiliaries, only to be crushed and scattered by the armored riders. Pizarro suspected certain indigenous allies of duplicity and had them burned alive. Still, Pizarro preferred to subdue the land with politics and not costly war, and so selected a 17-year-old named Manco to act as a puppet ruler. Manco was a son of Huayna Capac, who had recently fled persecution from the soldiers of Atahualpa. Now he and other Inca nobles joined the conquistador procession into Cusco. Manco Inca was crowned in a month-long ceremony, attended by the mummies of his great forefathers. That true power belonged to the Spaniards was plainly visible. Pizarro divided the palaces and great buildings of Cusco among his conquistadors, and proceeded to loot the city of nearly all its gold and silver artifacts, to be melted into ingots. The Spanish would do the same with almost every silver and gold item they found across the empire, such that only a few of these Inca relics survive today. Outside of Cusco, defiant Inca generals resisted the invaders over the next year, but backed by the authority of Manco Inca, the Spanish and their numerous indigenous allies would defeat them. Former enemies of the Incas who later opposed the rule of Atahualpa, such as the Chachapoyas of the tropical lowlands and the Cañaris of Ecuador, readily joined the Spanish usurper army and were repaid with privileges. The Spanish soon set about consolidating their new holdings. Conquistadors branched out to reap their encomienda rewards, rights to the labor of peoples across the empire. Pizarro, it seemed, had completed the conquest. His remaining enemies now lay within his own ranks. He and Almagro made competing claims for land and authority in the conquered realm. Confrontation was averted as Almagro led an expedition of over 500 Spaniards and 12,000 Incas to seek gold and expand the empire's southern dominions, while Pizarro went west to his newly established capital, Ciudad de los Reyes, or Lima. For all his cunning, the judgment of Pizarro was clouded by familial loyalty. He had left his impudent brothers Juan and Gonzalo in control of Cusco. The pair began to mock and extort Manco Inca for treasure. Conquistadors had ravaged indigenous women and claimed them as war prizes throughout the conquest. Now the brothers and their men openly violated the royal wives and relatives of Manco Inca. Gonzalo himself kidnapped and ravaged Cura Occhio, Manco's principal wife and sister. The outraged Manco Inca knew his people thought him a hollow ruler, who served only the foreign vandals, but no longer. Manco stirred his advisors to secretly set in motion a rebellion, a vast uprising to cast off the Spanish yoke. The Spanish promptly imprisoned Manco Inca on suspicion of treason, but the arrival of another Pizarro brother, Hernando, came with the royal command that the Inca king was to be treated with full dignity. Free again, Manco Inca rallied the rebel army. Across the empire, Inca subjects rose up and killed their encomendero overlords, and in the hills and valleys beyond Cusco, a great Inca army assembled. Some 100,000 warriors from across the realm had answered the call of Manco Inca. The Spanish trapped in Cusco numbered only 196 men, supplemented by a few enslaved Africans and 500 indigenous allies. In early May of 1536, the siege of Cusco began. Warriors swarmed the streets, and a gale of stones and arrows forced the Spaniards back to a few fortified positions, from which the foreigners cut down waves of attacks. Hernando Pizarro saw to it that any prisoners they took, including women, were executed or had their hands severed before release. Unable to dislodge the Spaniards, the Incas then began to burn their own sacred city. But in fiery sorties, Spanish cavalry charged out and cut down hundreds of Incas, who in turn developed anti-cavalry tactics. Incas pockmarked the streets with pits, sharpened stakes and barricades, and then flooded the surrounding area. The besieged Spaniards required a more defensible base. A Spanish and allied force sallied out and stormed Cusco's colossal fortification of Sacsayhuaman. For days they fought for inches, beaten back, battered by stones, until at last they scaled the high walls and slaughtered all the Incas within. Condors, they said, circled down to devour the dead. The Spaniards successfully held this new base, but the advance had come at a cost. A projectile had fractured the skull of Juan Pizarro in the first assaults and taken his life, and still Cusco remained surrounded. In Lima, Francisco Pizarro had been apprised of the rebellion. With fewer than 600 troops in his core area of conquest, each soldier appeared vital to the survival of his new domain. He dispatched reinforcements, with 70 cavalry sent to break the siege of Cusco. Manco Inca had predicted such a maneuver and already sent his finest general, Quiso, to the area. Through spies, Quiso and his army tracked the cavalry force, destroyed the bridge behind them, and in a narrow canyon, ambushed them. The trapped cavalry met rolling boulders, slings, and melee charges. Incas crushed, clubbed, and butchered the screaming invaders, taking only a few prisoners. Quiso proceeded to exterminate 3 more Spanish contingents. One Spaniard had earlier likened the discipline and organization of the Inca army to that of the Ottoman Turks, and Pizarro now grasped the power of his enemies. He frantically sent a plea to the Spanish governor of Guatemala. "Most magnificent sir, the Inca Emperor Manco has the city of Cusco besieged, and I have heard nothing about the Spaniards in it. The country is so badly damaged that no native chief now serves us, and they have won many victories against us. It is causing me such great sorrow that it is consuming my entire life, as well as the fear of losing the governorship. I beg of you to send me some help." Back in Cusco, the besieged Spaniards meagerly survived on food smuggled in by indigenous allies. By September, some parts of Pizarro's original rescue force did reach the city. The Incas gifted the Spanish 5 heads of their would-be rescuers. But the Incas, not fully aware of how written script functioned, had also delivered torn-up letters from the dead soldiers. The besieged Spanish, in an hour of utmost desperation, now gleaned from the letters that Francisco Pizarro was alive and fighting to break the siege. They would not yet abandon the fight. In January of 1537, Hernando charged out toward Manco Inca's base of Ollantaytambo, where he planned to capture the rebel king. But in the valley, the Spanish beheld mountains roiling with warriors. Volleys of furious stones and arrows repulsed the Spanish, who fell back to Cusco. The Inca triumph proved fleeting. Inca forces around the city had diminished over the 10-month siege, as many troops returned home to meet the demands of agricultural cycles. In months earlier, General Quiso had stormed Lima. Without the terrain advantage central to his tactics, Pizarro's men killed him and much of his army. Spanish forces, including freshly arrived reinforcements and the returning army of Almagro, now converged toward Cusco. Manco Inca would not suffer a massacre. He called off the siege and gathered his family, officials, and sacred valuables. Over mountains, through defiles, rivers, and woods, his caravan came to the place called Vitcos, then moved farther into the wilderness after a Spanish attack. Vilcabamba became the capital of a new jungle kingdom, where the exiled line of Incas would live on in shadow. Beyond the edges of this neo-Inca state, the conquistadors, driven as they were by land, title, and riches, turned against one another. Almagro conquered Cusco for himself and imprisoned Gonzalo and Hernando Pizarro. The war between conquistador factions began, and after the Battle of Las Salinas, Pizarro executed the vanquished Almagro. Francisco Pizarro and his men reveled in their newfound prestige and power. The Princess Kushidi Mayokyo, once ceremonially appointed the primary wife of Atahualpa, was only a girl of 10 years old at the time of the Spanish invasion. Now, 6 years later, the 60-year-old Pizarro took her as his concubine. She would bear him 2 sons. Deep in the forest, Manco Inca beheld the empire of his forebears defiled and gutted. Still, he would not yield. He forged a new kind of army. The sparsely clothed peoples of the Amazon, long considered barbarians by the Incas, now became his allies in a guerrilla war against the Spanish. Raiding parties emerged from the wilderness. They ambushed and slaughtered traveling Spaniards and plundered anything of use. And so some of this underground indigenous army began to traverse the jungle on horseback, or with steel helmets, swords, and guns. Fear spread among Spanish settlers. Gonzalo Pizarro resolved to move against the shadow capital of Vilcabamba. In 1539, he led 300 Spaniards and many auxiliaries on a maddening march through misty, trilling jungle, down sharp cliffs and coursing rivers. The Inca forces gave them battle but soon fled, leaving Gonzalo to sack the capital and again kidnap Manco's most beloved wife, Cura Occhio. The Spanish thereafter sent envoys to Manco Inca to arrange his surrender. Manco had them killed, so Francisco Pizarro repaid the gesture by having the exalted Cura Occhio stripped, tied to a stake, then beaten and shot with arrows. To the revulsion of even conquistador onlookers, the Pizarro brothers had overseen the torturous murder of an innocent noblewoman. When imprisoned Inca chiefs expressed outrage over the murder of their queen, Francisco Pizarro had them all publicly burned at the stake. The power of Pizarro relied on loyalty. Not all of his original conquistadors had chosen to stay in South America. Hernando de Soto now encountered the varied peoples of the American Southeast and became the first documented European to cross the Mississippi River. Back in Peru, Manco Inca exploited divisions within the Spanish ranks by allying with an anti-Pizarro faction led by the vengeful son of the late Almagro. On June 26, 1541, this faction ended the life of Francisco Pizarro with a blade in the throat and took power, only to be later violently ousted themselves by a crown-appointed governor. Spain sought direct control over her new land and subjects, for the bellicose conquistador dynasties had plundered and waged war in the distant New World with outsized authority. Some ousted Almagro supporters fled to the Neo-Inca state, where nobles and warriors walked paved roads hung with vines, where stone marvels revealed themselves and cool water streamed from fountains. Manco Inca offered the hunted Spaniards refuge here, and in return they trained his Inca troops to better use the firearms, weapons, and horses they had captured. It seemed a new chapter in the resistance movement, but in secret the allied Spaniards hoped to curry favor with colonial officials. So in 1544 they turned on their host and stabbed Manco Inca to death. The Neo-Inca state survived under an heir, but already the surrounding world had begun to change. The heartland of the Inca Empire, now a frontier of the unstoppable Spanish Empire. Cities of foreign architecture mapped the valleys and filled with newly arrived Spaniards, while indigenous inhabitants were made to work. Subjects of the Inca Empire had previously paid an annual tax of generally 2 to 3 months in labor, building infrastructure or monuments, tending farms, or making textiles. The Incas rotated tax demands so as not to strain communities, and provided subjects food in times of emergency. The new Spanish masters co-opted this labor system, demanding more work in harsher conditions and leaving many families destitute. Some were sent into the underworld. A Spanish missionary wrote, "In 1545 there was discovered a mouth of hell, into which have entered a great quantity of people, which by the greed of the Spaniards they sacrificed to their god. And these are some silver mines that they call Potosi. Enslaved Africans and over 10,000 native laborers each year were forced into the mountain, into dark and stifling mines which claimed the lives of many, while a massive town of 100,000 people grew like moss around the fount of treasure. For the next century, nearly half of the world's silver came from Potosi, the envy of sovereigns from Europe to the Ming Dynasty. In response to accounts of abuse and atrocity across the New World, the Spanish crown implemented some legal measures to regulate the treatment of its indigenous subjects, who nevertheless would continue to suffer exploitation, abuse, and social degradation by dint of heritage. Opponents of Spain and Catholicism in Europe would promote both real and embellished accounts of Spanish atrocities in what was later called Leyenda Negra, the black legend which cast Spaniards as uniquely unjust among the burgeoning colonial empires. That their opponents also brutalized people did not soothe the conscience of certain Spanish clergy and soldiers who believed their countrymen had disgraced God in the former lands of the Incas. Conquistador Cieza de León lamented, "Many, many times I have seen with my own eyes severe things done to these unfortunate people. And those who read it have patience because I cut short what I am relating, and do make use of reading about it to supplicate our Lord to pardon such grave sins." By 1572, just 4 decades since the invasion, disease, war, and hard labor had killed almost half of the native population in the fallen empire. Some survivors carved out status in the new colonial hierarchy, preserving history and traditions in doing so. And others, no doubt, still looked to the forest with a dream that the Neo-Inca state would resurrect the old empire. By then, Tupac Amaru, son of Manco Inca, sat on a lesser throne. He had hardly a chance of evading the Spaniards who hunted him in the wild. Soldiers brought him in chains to Cusco, and before a crowd of wailing onlookers, the conquerors beheaded the last Sapa Inca. So ended the Inca dynasty. It was only a handful of generations before that the great Pachacuti raised a line of regional kings to an imperial throne. He and his progeny commanded a mighty and flourishing empire, at once dominating, ingenious, and marvelous. The empire and its sovereign were no more. Yet a path remained for the people of the conquered Andes. A long trek of assimilation and resistance, peace and bloodshed, subjugation and sovereignty. Centuries later, among the high peaks, villagers and their herds still walk the old Inca roads, speaking Quechua as they go, and weathered walls and temples stand silent across the land. The last witnesses of the great Inca Empire. You're watching the renowned artist / my brother Joseph Feely make one of the roughly 70 original pieces of art he made for the video you just watched. To help him depict the Inca world authentically, I compiled over 200 pages of notes and references on everything from the materials of Inca peasant clothing to 1530s Spanish legwear. Between the researching and writing the script and citing my sources, and Joe manually spending several hours on each piece of art, each of the 2 episodes that we combined to make this one took months to make. If you're like us and you're sick of inaccurate, zero effort, and often machine-generated content drowning the internet, there are a couple ways you can help real human-created stuff survive on this platform. First, subscribe, like, comment, all that helps. Second, you can spend 30 seconds checking out the Patreon link in the description. It's the most direct way to support what we do, and we've also loaded it up with tons of bonus episodes, updates, Discord access, and more. Consider joining. Until next time, thanks.
In July of 1758, 3 British forces advanced on New France from every direction. To the east, General Amherst's cannons thundered at the formidable fortress of Louisbourg, as his men dug ever closer in a grueling siege. To the north, near Fort Ticonderoga, General Abercrombie's troops emerged from the woods and launched a bold assault on the French defenses near Rattlesnake Hill. To the south, General Forbes pressed westward toward Fort Duquesne, determined to drive the French from the contested Ohio country. From the wilderness of the frontier to the strategic waterways of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, British forces were poised to breach the gates of New France, while at sea the Royal Navy slowly tightened its grip on Atlantic supply lines. The colony was under siege, beset on all fronts. While France was busy on the battlefields of Europe trying to keep the British Empire and Prussia at bay, Britain reached across oceans with ruthless precision, determined to crush the French Empire and tear it apart. This was no ordinary campaign. It was characterized by the bloodiest open field battle of the French and Indian War, a classic Vauban-style siege, and a desperate race for indigenous and colonial support on the frontier. This is how modern historiography tells the story of the staggering siege of New France. By the end of 1757, the French appeared to have gained significant momentum in the French and Indian War. They had triumphed at the Battle of Oswego in 1756, driving the British off Lake Ontario, and had successfully repelled British forces from Louisbourg in 1757, denying them access to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Additionally, under Louis-Joseph de Montcalm-Gozon, Marquis de Montcalm de Saint-Véran, Montcalm for short, they had secured victory at the siege of Fort William Henry, effectively pushing British troops away from Lake George. In theory, the road to Fort Edward, and ultimately Albany, and thus the heartland of the 13 colonies, lay wide open. However, the aftermath of the famous massacre of Fort William Henry revealed serious problems for the French. Much of their resources, especially food and ammunition such as cannonballs, had been depleted. More importantly, many of their Native American allies abandoned the French cause after the siege. Frustrated that the spoils Montcalm had promised were never delivered, the French commander had promised the British safe conduct as part of the terms of surrender, something that was entirely alien to most native warriors. In an attempt to get what they believed they were owed, scalps, captives, and anything valuable they could trade, they attacked the retreating British column as it marched toward Fort Edward. The French tried to protect the British, but about 500 were taken as captives, and 185 were killed. Some Native Americans even attacked and scalped the sick inside the hospital at Fort William Henry. In a tragic twist of fate, doing so exposed them to numerous diseases, the most devastating of which was smallpox. After the warriors retreated to their communities, some more than 1,500 kilometers away from Fort William Henry, the disease spread rapidly among native communities. They came to believe that the French were to blame, leading them to withdraw their support from the foreign power in battle. The loss of native support forced the French to rely more heavily on regular troops sent from France. Meanwhile, the ongoing 7 Years' War was draining resources in Europe, with a British naval blockade having the most serious impact by steadily restricting France's ability to send provisions, soldiers, and weapons to New France. Compounding the problem, a poor harvest had devastated food supplies in Canada, further straining French resources. By New Year's Day of 1758, William Pitt, the British Secretary of State, had become aware of this situation. His strategy for the conflict in North America was designed to exploit France's weaknesses. Because France was strong in Europe, having assembled about 100,000 men near its northern shore, Pitt planned to remain on the defensive, focusing his attacks where France was vulnerable, in North America and the Atlantic Ocean. To undermine French resistance, the Secretary of State ordered Admiral Henry Osborne and Admiral Edward Hawke to block the French fleet at Brest, La Rochelle, and Cartagena, ensuring they could not support New France. In America, Pitt envisioned a series of 3 offensives aimed at the frontier and New France's heartland around Quebec and Montreal. The first, most crucial attack would be against Louisbourg, while additional strikes would target Fort Carillon and Fort Duquesne, stretching New France's forces thin and allowing the British to defeat them in detail. Brigadier General John Forbes gathered 6,000 men at Schenectady, to cut directly through Pennsylvania from Carlisle and across two formidable mountain ranges, the Alleghenies and the Laurel Ridge, to attack Fort Duquesne, the future site of Pittsburgh. This advance was designed to weaken French control of the Ohio country and disrupt their trade with the Native American nations around the Great Lakes. Meanwhile, near the ruins of Fort William Henry, General James Abercrombie gathered a large force of 16,000 men to attack Fort Carillon and invade Canada directly across the New York frontier. Lastly, at Halifax, Nova Scotia, General Jeffrey Amherst gathered 14,000 men for the Louisbourg campaign, aiming to open New France to an invasion through the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The British attack was ready to launch. In early 1758, the governor of New France, Pierre de Rigaud de Vaudreuil, Marquis de Vaudreuil, Vaudreuil for short, had fewer than 6,000 regular troops, an estimated 7,000 militiamen, and a small number of Native American allies to face British forces reportedly numbering around 50,000. Vaudreuil did exactly what William Pitt's strategy called for. He divided the French forces into three groups, allocating about 5,000 troops to defend Fort Carillon and Louisbourg, and sending a select force of around 3,000 to the Mohawk River and the northwestern frontier of New York. This meant the French would be heavily outnumbered in each campaign. However, they had a strategic advantage. They could rely on solid fortifications on all fronts. As a general rule, an attacking force needed roughly 3 times as many troops as the defenders to successfully besiege a fortress, so the French still had a fighting chance. In June of 1758, Montcalm departed Quebec for Fort Carillon, while François-Marie de Marchand de Lannery moved to Fort Duquesne and Augustin de Bonchonry de Drucourt was put in command of the defenses at Louisbourg. Of all the fortresses held by the French on the American continent, Louisbourg was the most formidable. Constructed as a star fort based on the principles of the renowned military engineer Sébastien Le Prêtre de Vauban, it was built to withstand the full force of an 18th century siege. On the landward side, Louisbourg was defended by 2 well-constructed bastions, the King and Queen, and 2 half-bastions, the Dauphin and the Princess. On the seaside, 11 French warships, including 5 ships of the line, were anchored at the bay to protect Louisbourg against naval attacks. The French had also reinforced the shoreline near the city to prevent a naval landing. At the time, Louisbourg was known as the Gibraltar of the North, a high compliment since Gibraltar, famously called the Rock, was one of the most formidable fortresses of the era. However, even the strongest Vauban-style fortifications could only hold for so long. Ironically, while Vauban had revolutionized fortress design, he also developed an almost infallible method to break them. In this approach, known as siège en forme, or formal siege, attackers methodically dug zigzagging trenches toward the walls, making them hard to hit from the defenses. The attacker advanced in a calculated pattern, positioning artillery to strike from optimal angles, gradually wearing down the defenses, driving the defenders from the walls, and ultimately reaching the fortress by bringing cannons through a network of trenches all the way up to the fortification walls. Drucourt knew that Louisbourg's survival depended on reinforcements from the French Navy breaking through Osborne's and Hawkes's blockades. If successful, the few ships at Louisbourg and the French fleet could drive off the British ships in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and clear a path for fresh troops from the heartland of New France to reach the besieged fortress. If not, it was only a matter of time before the defenders were worn down. On the 2nd of June, the British fleet anchored at Gabarus Bay, roughly 5 kilometers from Louisbourg. However, heavy rain limited their action to naval bombardment of the fortress from offshore. The assault landing at Louisbourg began on the 8th of June 1758. 3 divisions of the invading force prepared to come ashore, with one under the command of James Wolfe, targeting a cove on the left flank. However, the French had fortified the shoreline, forcing the British to battle through rough seas and enemy fire. Wolfe initially tried to call off the landing, but one of his commanders, William Howe, misunderstood the signal and landed anyway. When Wolfe saw the unexpected success, he reversed his decision and ordered the rest of his division to land at the same spot. That night, the British established their siege camp near Freshwater Brook, about 2.5 kilometers from the fortress. On the 12th of June, Wolfe was dispatched to capture Lighthouse Point, which controlled the access to the harbor. With that secured, all the pieces were in place to begin a formal siege. On the 19th of June, after nearly a week of preparation, the British artillery batteries were finally in place, and Geoffrey Amherst gave the order to open fire at the city's bastions and the French ships in the harbor. The digging of siege trenches, parallels and seps progressed steadily. By the 3rd of July, the British had constructed batteries within 550 meters of Louisbourg's landward defenses. On the 6th of July, mortar shells and incendiary bombs began to fall inside the city. In mounting desperation, the French launched a series of night sorties to destroy the British batteries, but with little success. The French were becoming increasingly desperate, and not just at Louisbourg, while the siege wore on with relentless bombardment by day and constant digging and entrenching by night. Farther to the west, General Abercrombie was ready to cross Lake George and open up a new front, while General Forbes had begun moving across the wilderness of Pennsylvania. The British offensive was poised to unleash its full force against New France.
Her Majesty set this one a task: investigate the leadership of the Veiled Heritance. The Veil's trail leads here to the town of Matisse.
When Montcalm arrived at Fort Carillon, he had a mere 3,500 men at his disposal, and notably only 15 native allies had shown up. Rations were calculated to last a maximum of 9 days. Therefore, reinforcements from Quebec were Montcalm's only real hope of winning a protracted siege. However, what he didn't know was, as historian Fred Anderson puts it, quote, the king, Louis XV, and his ministers were quietly writing New France out of France's grand strategy. France's resources were tied up in Europe, defending the coast against British raids and preparing for a possible invasion of England. As a result, Montcalm was largely on his own. Only François Gaston de Lévis, with 400 men, could be spared to reinforce Fort Carillon. Montcalm's adjutant noted, quote, "Our situation is critical. Action and audacity are our sole resources." On the 6th of July, French scouts at the northern end of Lake George spotted 4 columns of small boats slowly advancing across the water. Thousands of them, according to soldiers' journals, covering the lake from shore to shore. At the head of the fleet was Lord George Howe, General James Abercrombie's second-in-command. Howe was a seasoned officer, thoroughly familiar with warfare on the frontier's woodlands. He enjoyed the complete confidence of William Pitt, which is precisely why he had been placed under Abercrombie, whom Pitt deeply distrusted due to his lack of battlefield experience. Even Abercrombie's own soldiers didn't trust him, referring to him as Granny. Though Pitt wanted Howe to lead the expedition against Fort Carillon, Abercrombie's political connections and seniority secured him the top command. As Abercrombie's massive force of 16,000 troops closed in, the French, stunned by the size of the approaching army, retreated into the forest, abandoning much of their baggage. Howe, leading the advance guard, gave chase through the dense woods. The French rearguard fought a delaying action, frequently turning to slow their pursuers. Then, before the British could finally engage, a musket shot rang out from a concealed position, striking Lord Howe and killing him instantly. This was a devastating blow to the British morale before the battle had even begun. With Howe's death, the army lost most of its strategic edge. He had trained alongside Roger's Rangers, the elite scouting force intimately familiar with the frontier, and was one of the few officers with both an understanding of the unique demands of wilderness warfare and the authority to influence Abercrombie's decisions, whether due to the impact of Howe's loss or some other failure. Abercrombie did not regroup his men or continue the advance. Instead, the army made camp and delayed any further movement until the next day. Even then, they proceeded only halfway toward Fort Carillon, a distance that could be covered in 2 hours, before stopping again in camp. One provincial surgeon captured the growing frustration, writing, quote, "I can't but observe since Lord Howe's death, business seems a little stagnant." It was not until the 8th of July that Abercrombie finally ordered scouts to reconnoiter the enemy's position. From the edge of the forest, they saw that the French had taken full advantage of the 2 days since the British landing. Montcalm, fully aware that the stone walls of Fort Carillon wouldn't hold for long, had ordered his men to pick up shovels and axes. On the rise of the hill behind the fort, they built a formidable wooden field fortification. This position was crucial because cannons placed there could easily target the fort, which is why the French were determined to hold it. In front of a sandbag reinforced palisade and breastwork, they carved out a deadly killing field. The forward slope was lined with a tangled mess of abatis, sharpened tree limbs and felled trunks designed to break the enemy formations and slow their advance. Further down, another barrier of sharpened stakes was erected to disrupt approaching infantry formations and channel them into the line of fire. The entire hillside had been transformed into a gauntlet, ideal for cutting down attackers with grape shot and musket volleys. Any frontal assault on this position would come at a terrible cost, staining the slope red with blood. Around midday of the 8th of July, Rufus Putnam was working on the fortifications of the entrenched British camp roughly 1.5 kilometers from Rattlesnake Hill. All day he had heard the thunder of cannons, crackling musket fire, and distant screams echoing through the woods. Like General Abercrombie, who also remained at the camp, Putnam had no clear idea of what was actually unfolding on top of the hill. Convinced he could take it quickly and then besiege Fort Carillon, Abercrombie had ordered a frontal assault on the French palisades. Remaining in the safety of the camp, he relied solely on sparse dispatches from the front, and simply continued ordering frontal assaults, completely unaware of the disaster his decisions were causing. Worse still, he kept the entire artillery at the camp, which left his infantry to attack without any supporting firepower. Up on the hill, British scouts were the first to reach the abatis. They drove off the French pickets and took up sniping positions, just as Lord Howe had taught them. For a brief moment, it looked like the British might take a measured approach, pushing slowly up the hill from cover to cover, possibly even outflanking the French defensive line. But Abercrombie's battle plan suggested otherwise. He had ordered 3 long infantry columns to push directly up the hill. Shortly after midday, more than 8,000 British soldiers advanced to the sound of drums and bagpipes, charging into the dense tangle of sharpened trees. The British right reached the first line of abatis before the other columns. As they came within range of the French muskets, they were met with a brutal volley. Caught in the open and tangled in the abatis, they were easy targets. Musket balls tore through the ranks as the French, firing from behind cover, picked them off at will. The killing field became a slaughterhouse. The soldiers were, quote, cut down like grass, wrote Joseph Nichols, a Massachusetts private. Another survivor recalled, quote, we had orders to run up to the breastwork and get in if we could, but we never reached it. Most men took cover behind trees, logs, and stumps, shielding themselves as best as they could from the relentless French fire. The ground was littered with the dead and dying. The situation grew so desperate that the French paused their volleys to let the smoke clear, allowing them to aim more accurately. Only on the British left did a handful of soldiers manage a desperate push that actually reached the base of the French wall. But those who successfully scaled the breastwork were met with bayonets and cut down immediately. Back at the entrenched camp, Rufus Putnam worried he might be seen as a coward for not participating in the fighting, and volunteered to deliver ammunition to the front lines. When he arrived in the evening, he found the battlefield in chaos. No orders had come from the officers, and the soldiers, pinned down and leaderless, simply lay there, unable to advance, unable to retreat. They remained in place until sunset, when they began to quietly slip away, leaving behind the dead and most of the wounded. As night fell, waves of bloodied, broken men poured back into Abercrombie's camp. Only then did the full scope of the disaster at Rattlesnake Hill become apparent. With over 2,000 British dead, Abercrombie, terrified of a French counterattack, ordered an immediate retreat to the boats on Lake George. Confused and demoralized, the soldiers stumbled through the darkness toward the shore. As they neared the water, panic took over and the retreat dissolved into a full stampede for the boats. At dawn on the 9th of July, the largest British army ever assembled in North America was rowing for its life up Lake George, fleeing from an enemy less than a quarter its size, which wasn't even in pursuit. With their victory at the Battle of Fort Carillon, the French theoretically gained the ability to shift the balance of power at Louisbourg. Montcalm could have marched his men north toward Montreal and then sent them to Louisbourg by sea, while the French fleet attempted to break the naval blockade. But the French at Carillon lacked accurate intelligence, and shaken by Abercrombie's massive force, feared another British assault and decided to stay put, spending the rest of the summer reinforcing their defenses. At sea, the British also maintained control. The French fleet at La Rochelle remained blockaded by Admiral Edward Hawke, while at Cartagena, the French could only watch as the English under Henry Osborne eventually lifted the blockade, but only because Osborne knew that, on average, a ship of the line needed about 8 weeks to cross from Spain to North America. This meant the French ships couldn't reach Louisbourg before October, by which time the campaigning season would be over and winter setting in. Meanwhile, at Louisbourg, General Amherst was unaware of any bad news from the Battle of Fort Carillon and pressed on relentlessly. His trenches inched ever closer to the enemy bastions, and his batteries thundered at the town without pause. On the 21st of July, a red-hot cannonball struck one of the French ships of the line anchored in the harbor, igniting its powder magazine and causing a devastating explosion. The blast destroyed the ship and its 2 closest neighbors, burning all 3 vessels down to the waterline. However, the attackers also used red-hot cannonballs on the city, and by this point, fire was causing as much damage to the city as to the fleet. On the 22nd of July, the King's Bastion, the cornerstone of Louisbourg's landward defenses, caught fire. Under a relentless rain of red-hot shot from British artillery, buildings within the fortress ignited faster than the overwhelmed fire crews could extinguish them. Exploiting the confusion, on the night of the 25th of July, hidden by a thick fog, sailors from the British fleet rode into the harbor. They boarded the 2 remaining ships of the line, setting one ablaze and towing the other, the 64-gun Bienfaisant, to safety across the harbor. The loss of the Bienfaisant, not only the final surviving ship of the line, but also the squadron's flagship, delivered a crushing blow to French morale. Worse still, the British intensified their efforts. Following Vauban's siege doctrine to the latter, they unleashed a relentless bombardment, firing nearly 1,000 rounds into the city over the next 12 days. By then, Drucour had little choice. Nearly a third of his garrison had been killed or wounded by bombardment or disease. Only 4 serviceable cannons remained in the last functioning battery. 6 British ships of the line were preparing to sail into the harbor and bombard the city from the undefended seaward side, and a breaching battery was poised to open fire at close range on the landward wall. On the morning of the 26th of July, with no hope of holding out and unwilling to sacrifice more lives needlessly, Drucour raised a flag of truce and requested terms for surrender. Louisbourg had held out just long enough to prevent a British assault on Quebec in 1758. As the campaign season was slowly drawing to a close, and a winter assault on Canada was far from ideal. However, the eventual fall of Louisbourg marked a turning point, triggering the collapse of French control across much of Atlantic Canada. From their foothold at Louisbourg, British forces spent the remainder of the year driving out French troops and occupying settlements in what are now New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland. On the final remaining front, the Western campaign against Fort Duquesne, Brigadier General Forbes had worked tirelessly to build a road across the wilderness of Pennsylvania. His efforts to wrest control of the Great Lakes and their valuable trade with the natives from the French were bolstered by two key developments. First, the British victory at Fort Frontenac in August of 1758, which cut off supplies to Fort Duquesne. And second, successful negotiations with the Ohio indigenous nations, formalized in the Treaty of Easton, where they agreed to abandon the French cause at Britain's urging. Outnumbered 10-1, with no native allies and dwindling supplies, the French commander of Fort Duquesne chose to set the fort ablaze and retreat. The British would soon build Fort Pitt on its ruins. With French control of the frontier collapsing, the Gulf of St. Lawrence opened to invasion through Louisburg, and only Fort Carillon remaining as the main defensive stronghold between the advancing British and the heartland of New France, little stood in the way of an attack on Quebec and Montreal. The French Empire was about to crumble. If you found this video entertaining or educational, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Creating this content takes a lot of time and effort. Even a small tip can make a big difference in keeping the channel going. As a thank you, our Patreon supporters get regular updates and exclusive artwork previews. Your support means a lot. Thank you.
Why would they attract? It's amazing. There's a big.
On the 12th of April, 1781, the Spanish opened fire on the fortress of Gibraltar. For almost 2 years, they had tried in vain to starve out the small British garrison. Now, they resorted to more drastic measures. The following years saw the use of fire ships and floating gun platforms, desperate sorties and a grand assault, seemingly impossible tunnels and spectacular innovations in the use of artillery. The stakes were high, as Great Britain was simultaneously fighting for two of its most valuable possessions: Gibraltar in the Mediterranean and its colonies in America. For this reason, the Great Siege of Gibraltar is considered the largest battle in the American Revolutionary War. Lasting over 3 years and 7 months, the Siege of Gibraltar is considered the longest siege ever endured by British forces. Gibraltar is located on the northern side of the Strait of Gibraltar, which connects the Atlantic Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. Great Britain had conquered the peninsula, known for obvious reasons as the Rock, in 1704 from the Spanish, who were unable to reclaim it by either diplomatic or military means in the following decades. But when the Revolutionary War broke out in 1775, an opportunity arose. The French, who had sided with the American colonies and officially declared war on Great Britain in 1778, were faced with the problem that their fleet was too weak to fight a war overseas. Therefore, they persuaded King Charles III of Spain to come to their aid by promising to support him in the reconquest of Gibraltar and Minorca. This forced Britain to fight a war on two fronts. In the Old World, Spain and France threatened its possessions directly. In the New World, it slowly lost control over its colonies. The question how Britain divided its forces was decisive not only for the outcome of the siege, but also for the outcome of the American Revolutionary War. Spain opened its offensive against Gibraltar on the 21st of June, 1779. The British governor, George August Eliot, was a prudent man and had prepared for this eventuality. Around 5,400 soldiers guarded the natural fortress of Gibraltar. The Rock was surrounded by water on 3 sides, with impassable cliffs to the east and northeast. Lieutenant Colonel William Greene, the garrison's chief engineer, had built state-of-the-art fortifications during the 10 years before the siege. The only access from the land was secured by ramparts with a ditch, in front of which lay a flooded salt field. Several batteries on the hills above dominated the isthmus, and a long wall with bastions ran along the bay, catching any approaching ship in a hull-breaking crossfire. It was clear to both sides that this fortress could not be stormed. It had to be slowly forced to its knees. The man who took on this task was Martin Alvarez de Sotomayor. This experienced general sealed off Gibraltar from the outside within a few days. What made his life easier was the fact that there had already been a line of fortifications at the northern end of the isthmus since 1727, which he now manned and reinforced, while Admiral Antonio Barcelo established a naval blockade. Alvarez had just enough men and ships to ensure the defenders ran low in supplies, but not enough to prevent daring sailors from repeatedly breaking through to Gibraltar and bringing small amounts of provisions to the city. This was because France and Spain were concentrating their forces on a different plan. They wanted to attack Great Britain directly, to compel it to divide its forces still further. During the spring of 1779, they prepared an invasion fleet, which crossed the English Channel at the end of July. However, the expedition was doomed to fail. There was only one minor naval engagement off Plymouth, before starvation and disease weakened the invaders and forced them to retreat to the port of Brest. The French Queen, Marie Antoinette, she of cake fame, commented in disappointment, quote, "Our fleet was not able to engage the English and has done nothing at all. It was a wasted campaign." While England breathed a sigh of relief, Gibraltar now faced Spain's full military might. So far, both sides had limited themselves to reinforcing their positions, but at the end of August, Elliot observed from the highest point of the rock, from where he could survey the entire hinterland with his telescope, that the Spanish were setting up a large camp and building a mortar battery at Fort St. Philip. He now expected them to open fire any day and decided to take the initiative. By the 12th of September 1779, Elliot's engineers had completed a new battery high up on the cliff, Green's Lodge, allowing them to take better advantage of the height. Instead of waiting for the Spanish to open fire, the defenders took action. As the Spaniards continued their work on the batteries of the northern barrier the following night, Elliot's gunners opened fire on them. When the workmen withdrew, they paused, only to resume firing as soon as they ventured out of cover again. The gun emplacement on the rock was so high up that it commanded an almost perfect view of everything happening below. It proved so effective that Green had another one built at the very top. This was a huge undertaking, as the summit was already difficult to reach on foot, and now a 24-pounder weighing a good 2 tons had to be heaved up there. 150 men with pulleys toiled for 4 days until the gun was finally mounted. The new position overlooked the entire isthmus and was appropriately named the Sky Battery. The 2 new batteries became even more effective when a captain of artillery, John Mercer, experimented with a new firing mode. He constructed small mortar shells and fired them from ordinary guns in order to combine their deadly explosions with the range of the cannon. After several attempts, he was able to shorten the fuses of the grenades precisely to the point where they exploded before impact, and sent a hail of shrapnel down upon the enemy. After the siege, the young artilleryman, Henry Shrapnel, who had witnessed the experiments, refined these improvised grenade cannonballs into a weapon that would revolutionize the world of artillery, the shrapnel shell. Thanks to these new batteries, the defenders were in an ideal position. Anyone approaching their walls had to run a deadly gauntlet across the isthmus. The only thing that worried Elliot was that the supplies were running low. For this reason, he asked for reinforcements from Great Britain, in the hope that they would arrive before hunger and disease overwhelmed his men. The constant expectation of an attack frayed the nerves of the defenders. Although they were now firing incessantly at the enemy workmen, and the Spanish guns had long been ready, the Spanish had yet to fire a single shot at the fortress itself by the end of 1779. This was part of Alvarez's plan. He had learned from a deserter that the defenders' supplies were running low, and had decided to let hunger and fear do his work for him. In fact, the people of Gibraltar were already struggling with the consequences of the blockade. Firewood was becoming scarce. fresh food was running out, and an outbreak of smallpox was affecting the civilian population. Elliot refused to intervene in the market and kept prices, which meant that even simple things like bread became immensely expensive. This was a sober calculation, as the governor knew that high profits were the only incentive for many captains to risk ships and lives running the blockade. But even without price caps, fewer and fewer ships reached the city, and Elliot had to cut the soldiers' rations at the beginning of 1780. If you want to follow in the footsteps of George August Elliot and visit Gibraltar, but don't want to spend hours looking for SIM card stores or pay excessive roaming fees, then consider using the service of today's sponsor, Saily eSIM. Saily offers affordable data packages for over 180 destinations, ensuring you will always have a reliable connection. It's super simple. Download the Saily app, choose your data package, and install the eSIM before you travel. Upon arrival, Saily eSIM will activate automatically, and you can start surfing right after you land at your destination. With Saily, you'll never again accidentally connect to another provider's network and pay high fees. And you'll also be safer because you won't have to connect to a dodgy Wi-Fi or buy a SIM card from dubious street vendors. Saily is compatible with iOS and Android devices, has a 24/7 chat support, and offers a full refund if your device is not compatible with an eSIM for any reason. Get an exclusive 15% discount on your Saily eSIM data plan. Download Saily and use the code SandroMan at checkout. The Spanish Dons, as the English mockingly called them, fared little better. A winter storm devastated their camp, flooded their trenches, and almost paralyzed their already sluggish supply lines. Some of them were so hungry that they ventured near the defenders to steal vegetables from their gardens in the no man's land. The defenders drove them off with an artillery volley. Colonel Price, who had apparently not lost his sense of humor despite all the hardships, estimated the losses of this nighttime battle, quote, by the most authentic accounts, to 8 cabbages and a pennyworth of parsley. In mid-January, the guards on the seawall excitedly announced the arrival of a large fleet. Soon, they realized it was the long-awaited relief commanded by Admiral George Bridges Rodney, the commander of the West Indies fleet. Rodney had sailed south from Plymouth about a month earlier, sent part of his fleet to the colonies at Cape Finisterre, and then fought his way past a Spanish fleet at Cape St. Vincent on the 16th of January in the so-called Moonlight Battle. When the Royal Navy entered the Bay of Gibraltar, Barcelo withdrew with his inferior blockade fleet, and Rodney landed unhindered. He brought the 73rd Highland Regiment of Foot as reinforcements, and so many supplies that it took several days to unload the ships. The presence of the Royal Navy gave the defenders some respite, but this ended immediately when Rodney set sail for the Americas in mid-February. Spain's attempt to starve out Gibraltar entered its second round. For almost a year now, the Spanish had done nothing but set up a military zone around the peninsula and watch as the defenders starved and battled smallpox and the typhus that had come to Gibraltar with the supplies. To undermine their morale even further, Alvarez had his troops carry out mock attacks on replicas of the defenses within sight of the rock. But an actual attack was also not long in coming, although it would come from an unexpected quarter. On the night of the 6th to the 7th of June, the Enterprise, one of the defenders' ships, suddenly sounded the alarm. The men who rushed to the seawall were presented with a terrifying sight. 9 fireships lit up the harbor and were drifting dangerously fast toward the new mole. Admiral Barcelo had set his sights on the 2 largest ships of the defenders, the Panther and the Enterprise, which had repeatedly managed to escort supplies through the blockade in recent months. The guns of the seawall opened fire immediately, but they failed to sink all the fireships. Only at the very last moment were a handful of death-defying men able to avert the danger by towing away the remaining fireships using rowboats. Barcelo was incandescent with rage and immediately set about his next plan. 3 weeks later, the defenders were again roused from their sleep by an unexpected attack. Under cover of darkness, several guns opened fire on the Panther from the bay. The defenders returned fire, but all they could see were muzzle flashes, so the enemy kept slipping through their fingers. The troublemakers soon turned out to be gunboats. They each had a large cannon at the bow and were rowed, which made them highly maneuverable. These boats would become a real nuisance for the defenders throughout the siege. They returned night after night to fire a few bullets at the ships or the city, and then immediately retreated. Although they caused only minor damage, they spread fear and terror. Nowhere was safe in the town. Worse still was that Barcelo used the boats to close gaps in the blockade. As a result, hardly any ships made it to Gibraltar anymore. On top of that, the Sultan of Morocco, who had constantly sent supplies to the British across the strait, switched sides in mid-July, and the tiny stream of provisions dried up almost completely. It wasn't long before the defenders ran out of fresh food, and diseases such as scurvy began to spread. Scurvy, the disease of sailors, is caused by vitamin C deficiency and leads to physical fatigue, severe pain, and inexplicable bruising, often around the mouth, famously causing teeth to come loose over time. By mid-September, almost the entire garrison was affected. Some could only drag themselves to their post on crutches. The defenders had reached a low point. In early October, a Danish merchantman on its way to the Mediterranean ventured too close to the southern end of Gibraltar. The garrison intercepted him and found oranges, lemons, figs, and raisins in its hold, just what the scurvy-stricken people desperately needed. The soldier, John Drinkwater, who wrote one of the most detailed reports of the siege, noted, quote, "The salutary effects were almost instantaneous. In a few days, men who had been considered as irrecoverable left their beds to congratulate their comrades on the prospect of once more becoming useful to their country." However, the amount of fresh fruit was small and only brought short-term relief. On top of that, the Spanish changed their strategy in October of 1780. In a nighttime operation, they destroyed the wooden huts in the gardens, set fire to the defenders' palisades, and thrust several trenches into the no-man's land. Once again, the defenders tried to slow them down by bombarding the workmen. William Greene's wife, who lived very close to a battery, complained about the inconvenience this caused her. Quote, "It absolutely shakes my bed with violence." Despite Mrs. Greene's great dissatisfaction with what was shaking her bed, the Spanish soon completed a new position, the St. Carlos battery. Elliot was concerned, recognizing that they could reach almost the entire town from there. In order to give the attackers as good as they got, the defenders strode throughout the siege to optimize their gun positions and find new methods of harassing the enemy. They were constantly trying to improve the precision of their artillery and do greater damage. The soldier Samuel Ansell wrote, quote, "I suppose in a few weeks more practice, the gunners will be so expert in leveling a gun that should a Spaniard raise his head above the epaulement or parapet, it will be immediately severed from his shoulders." As the Spanish trenches drew closer, the defenders were no longer able to reach them from the upper batteries, as their guns could not be tilted forward far enough. To solve this problem, an engineer named George Köhler came up with yet another innovation, the so-called Köhler depressing carriage. This adjustable gun carriage allowed for the guns to fire downwards and was equipped with a glider to cushion the recoil. Köhler's carriage was the precursor of later artillery recoil systems. The people on the rock had been fighting for their lives for 2 years now. The enemy had inflicted few losses on them, but hunger, disease and despair were slowly wearing them down. The few provisions left in the storehouses had become almost inedible, and cats and dogs had been virtually wiped out. Slowly but surely, the defenders' hopes were fading. What they didn't know was that a second relief fleet was already being assembled in England. This was a decision with enormous political implications. Vice Admiral George Darby had to abandon the blockade of the French fleet in the port of Brest in order to gather enough ships. Because of this, the French were able to send a convoy of reinforcements to the American colonies. Reinforcements that were to play a decisive role in the last major battle of the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Yorktown. Darby arrived in Gibraltar on the 12th of April, 1781. The Spanish gunboats tried to block his way, but withdrew when his warships formed a line of battle. The defenders cheered with relief when the first ships docked at the new mole and began to unload their cargo. But just a few moments later, a menacing rumble of thunder overshadowed the cheerful mood. The Spanish bombardment had begun. In the first 24 hours alone, around 3,000 cannonballs and mortar shells fell on Gibraltar. Although the defenders had been almost longing for the Spanish to do something at last, the attack now hit them harder than expected. No one had suspected that they, quote, would attempt to obliterate soldiers and civilian alike with such a degree of ferocity, death, and destruction. Soon, the first houses collapsed. Fires were raging throughout the city, and people fled south to escape the hail of bullets. The garrison bravely returned fire and hurriedly unloaded one ship after another so Darby could leave on the 20th of April. When he set sail, Gibraltar lay in ruins. Over the next few months, the Spanish guns thundered incessantly. The only exception to the rule was a brief daily pause in hostilities, exactly 6 hours after sunrise. This break, Ansel wrote, quote, arose from a custom pretty general in Spain, and common, I believe, in most warm climates, that of indulging themselves with a meridian nap. In other words, the Spaniards took a siesta. On the other hand, the gunboats disturbed the defenders' sleep night after night. Many of them had moved south of the city and built an improvised village of huts and tents out of reach of the Spanish batteries. In their new dwellings, however, they were exposed to the gunboats, and more than once someone lost an arm or a leg when a cannonball rolled through their tent. On seeing this, Elliot decided to fight fire with fire and had 2 sea mortars brought to the old mole, massive guns that hurled bombs of more than 100 kilograms over long distances. Soon they were being fired directly into the Spanish camp, thoroughly spoiling the Duns' afternoon nap. In July, there was a sudden commotion in the Spanish camp as many of the troops left in order to help the French in the conquest of Great Britain's other base in the Mediterranean, Minorca. The combined army was commanded by a man with the melodious name of Louis de Breton de Bal de Crillon, or Duc de Crillon for short. It landed at Punta Prima on the 19th of August and laid siege to the British port, St. Philip. On the 25th of November, news arrived in London that the American colonies and their French allies had won the Battle of Yorktown. Britain had lost the last major clash of the Revolutionary War. Many believed the defeat was the result of the decision to support Gibraltar. They maintained that the war in America could have been won if the French reinforcements had not been allowed to pass, and if more troops had been sent there. In their eyes, Britain had sacrificed America to save Gibraltar. And now Gibraltar was also at risk, as the Spanish had advanced their positions in the fall of 1781 and established 2 more positions near the battery of St. Carlos, St. Pascal and St. Martin. They now had 3 large batteries that could fire far into the town. This and the deserters' news of a pending attack prompted Elliot to risk a sortie. On the evening of the 26th